Hello guys, welcome back to Boring Historian. Tonight we are cloaking ourselves in the rough-spun wool of yesteryear and tiptoeing, not into the gaslit streets of Victorian England, but much, much, much further back, into a time of castles and knights, of plagues and prayers, of serfs and sovereigns. The medieval period. Imagine, if you will, a world without smartphones, without dating apps, without even the concept of a romantic dinner for two followed by a movie. You're there, perhaps in a smoky, torch-lit hall, the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and roasting meat heavy in the air. And the idea of dating, as you know it is, as fantastical as a dragon. It's a deep, and I mean deep, dive into how people found their partners in a world rigidly structured by hierarchy, tradition, and the ever-watchful eyes of family and church. You probably once survived this exploration of medieval matchmaking without a newfound appreciation for your right to choose your own Netflix and chill companion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a fascinating glimpse into our global community of history, buffs and night owls. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is, let's say, 1348, or perhaps 702, or maybe 1475. The medieval period, or Middle Ages, stretches for a vast swathe of time, roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century. And things certainly changed over those 1,000 years. But for all purposes, let's settle into a sort of generalized medievalness. A tapestry woven the threads of what life was generally like for many in Western Europe during this long era. You are here not in your comfortable 21st century bed, but perhaps on a straw-filled pallet in a timber-framed cottage, the wind whistling through the wattle and daub walls. Or maybe, if you're of higher birth, you're within the cold stone embrace of a castle, the distant sounds of sentries and the baying of hounds lulling you, or failing to lull you towards sleep. Forget swiping right or left. Forget sliding into DMs. Forget agonizing over the perfect opening line or crafting a witty online dating profile. The very notion of dating, as a period of romantic exploration with multiple partners, driven by individual choice and mutual attraction, simply doesn't exist for most people in this world. If you're picturing yourself coyly asking a handsome blacksmith or a demure lady-in-waiting if they're free next Friday, you'd likely be met with a blank stare, or possibly a recommendation to see a priest about your strange utterances. Life is too short, too precarious, and too governed by external forces for such individualistic frivolities. A mainstream historical fact to ground us. Average life expectancy in medieval England, for example, fluctuated. But for much of the period, if you survived childhood, which was a big if, you might expect to live into your 30s or 40s, though some who survived the initial hurdles lived much, much longer. Still, there wasn't a vast expanse of youthful years to dedicate to serial romance. The air you breathe is different. It's thick with the smells of life lived close to the earth and to animals. Wood smoke is a constant, from cooking fires and hearths. In towns, the narrow streets, unpaved and lacking sanitation, would be an assault on modern nostrils. A pungent mix of animal dung, human waste, thrown from windows, the cry of Gardez-l'eau from the French Gardez-l'eau, watch out for the water, was a genuine warning. Rotting garbage and the smells of various trades, tanning leather, butchering meat, brewing ale. Even in the countryside, the scent of manure, damp earth, and livestock would be your constant companions. Your soundscape too is alien. No hum of traffic, no electronic beeps. Instead, you hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of wooden cartwheels over rough tracks, the shouts of vendors, the lowing of cattle, the crowing of roosters at unwelcome hours, the peal of church bells marking the canonical hours, and reminding you of your spiritual duties, and the ever-present sounds of human labor chopping wood, grinding grain, spinning wool. Privacy as we understand it is a rare luxury. Most people live in close quarters with their families, sometimes with multiple generations under one small roof. Even in noble households, servants are ubiquitous, and personal chambers are not necessarily private sanctuaries. Your life is an open book, or rather, an open scroll, for your family, your neighbors, and your community to read. And they do, with great interest. Every action, every association is noted and commented upon. In such a world, the idea of discreetly getting to know someone in a romantic sense is fraught with difficulty and potential scandal. So, if dating is off the table, what's on it? For the vast majority, the primary goal of any interaction between a young man and a young woman of marriageable age is, unsurprisingly, marriage. And marriage, for most of medieval society, especially the land-owning classes, is less about love and personal fulfillment and more about, well, practicalities. It's about alliances between families, the consolidation of land and wealth, the production of legitimate heirs to inherit property and titles, and the securing of social stability. Think of it less as a rom-com and more as a strategic business merger, with you perhaps as one of the key assets being negotiated. This doesn't mean that love and affection didn't exist. Of course they did. Humans are humans, but they were often seen as a potential bonus, a welcome addition to a marriage, rather than its primary foundation. Sometimes love might blossom after the wedding, cultivated through shared life and mutual respect. Sometimes it wouldn't. And sometimes romantic love existed entirely outside the bounds of marriage, in clandestine affairs, or in the idealized, often unattainable, realm of courtly love, which we'll explore later. Imagine you're a young woman of noble birth, say Lady Eleanor, aged 16. You've spent your life thus far in your father's castle, learning the skills deemed appropriate for your station. Needlework, perhaps a little music, how to manage a household, and crucially, how to be pious and obedient. You might have seen your future husband only once or twice, or perhaps not at all. Your father, with the counsel of his advisors, and perhaps your mother, has been carefully considering potential matches for you since you were a child. He's looking for a husband who can offer a strong alliance, perhaps bringing with him valuable lands, or bolstering your family's political influence, or providing military support. Your personal preferences, your dreams of a dashing knight or a sensitive poet, are, frankly, secondary concerns, if they are concerns at all. You are a pawn, albeit a cherished one, in a much larger game of dynastic ambition. Your wedding day might be the first time you have any extended conversation with the man whose name you will bear, and whose children you are expected to produce. It's a sobering thought, a far cry from choosing a partner based on shared hobbies and whether they make you laugh. You wouldn't be discussing if he's a dog person or a cat person. You'd be more concerned if his family's army was likely to show up if your father's lands were threatened. Or perhaps you're a young man, Thomas, the son of a prosperous merchant in a growing town. Your father is keen for you to marry the daughter of another merchant, one whose connections could open up new trade routes or secure favorable terms for your family's business. You might have glimpsed the young lady at market or at church, but your interactions would have been formal and carefully supervised. The negotiations for your marriage would involve discussions of dowry, the property or money brought by a bride to her husband, on their marriage and other financial arrangements. Your future is being mapped out not by the flutters of your heart, but by the calculations of commerce. Again, love might grow, or you might both find solace in your shared prosperity and the raising of your children. But the initial impetus is overwhelmingly practical. This emphasis on practicality stems directly from the structure of medieval society. Feudalism, the dominant social system in much of Europe, was a hierarchical structure of obligations and allegiances. At the top was the king, who granted land fiefs to his nobles' vassals in exchange for military service and loyalty. These nobles, in turn, might grant land to lesser nobles or knights. At the bottom were the peasants or serfs, who worked the land bound to their lord's estate in exchange for protection. Society was often broadly conceived as comprising those who pray the clergy, those who fight the nobility, and those who worked the peasantry. Your place within this structure, your rights, your obligations, and indeed your marriage prospects were largely determined by your birth. There was some social mobility, especially in towns with their emerging merchant class. But for many, your station in life was fixed. The church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe, was an immensely powerful institution, its influence permeating every aspect of medieval life, from birth to death, and very much including marriage. The church taught that marriage was a sacrament, a sacred union ordained by God. It defined the rules of who could marry whom, prohibiting marriage between close relatives, for instance, through complex laws of consanguinity and affinity. And it increasingly asserted its authority over the legal and spiritual aspects of matrimony. While the church emphasized the importance of consent for a valid marriage, both parties had to agree. At least in theory, this consent was often given within a framework of immense family and societal pressure. The church also had strong views on sex and procreation, viewing the latter as the primary purpose of marital relations. All of this created a powerful framework within which any courtship or path to marriage had to operate. So, if you're not dating, how do you even get to the point of marriage negotiations? Interactions between young, unmarried men and women were generally quite limited and carefully controlled, especially in the upper classes. Young noble women were often educated in convents or in the households of other noble families, where they would be under strict supervision. Their public appearances would be chaperoned. Opportunities for casual, unobserved conversation with young men were rare. Social gatherings, feasts, tournaments, religious festivals, weddings provided occasions for young people to see and be seen. But even here, decorum was paramount. A glance, a shared dance if you were lucky enough to be at an event where such things occurred, a politely exchanged word. These might be the only sparks to fly. It's a world away from the relative freedom and autonomy we take for granted. Think of it as a highly choreographed dance where everyone knows the steps, and a misstep can have serious consequences for your reputation and your family's honor. Even for the lower classes, while there might have been a bit more freedom from the intense scrutiny of dynastic politics, life was still lived very much in the public eye of the village community. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. In some rural communities, there were folk customs that allowed for a degree of premarital interaction, or even trial periods, sometimes referred to by later folklorists with terms like hand-fasting or bundling, though the exact nature and prevalence of these practices are often debated by historians and varied enormously by region and time. Bundling, for instance, supposedly involved a courting couple spending the night in the same bed, but fully clothed and sometimes with a bundling board between them or the maiden's legs tied together in a sack, an attempt to allow intimacy without impropriety. Sounds cozy, right? Almost as effective as putting a pillow wall down the middle of the bed, which we all know is an impenetrable fortress. Historians still argue whether the concept of romantic love as a basis for marriage truly took root during the medieval period, or if it remained largely an idealized literary trope, separate from the realities of most marital unions. The rise of courtly love poetry and troubadour songs in the High Middle Ages certainly celebrated passionate, often adulterous, and usually unrequited love for an idealized lady. But was this a reflection of real-life romantic aspirations, or a sophisticated literary game played by the elite? A kind of escapism from the often pragmatic and unromantic nature of their actual marriages? It's a complex question, and the answer likely lies somewhere in between. Human emotions are rarely neat and tidy. What is clear is that for you, our medieval individual, the path to partnership is not one you walk alone. Your family, your community, your lord, your church, all have a vested interest in your choices, or rather, in the choices made for you. The selection of a spouse is too important a matter to be left to the fleeting fancies of youth. It's about survival, stability, and the continuation of the social order. There's a certain security in this. Perhaps you don't have the anxiety of endless choice that we face today, but there's also a profound lack of personal agency. Your future, your happiness, your most intimate relationships are often in the hands of others. Imagine yourself at a village festival. The music is loud, played on pipes and drums, perhaps a fiddle. People are dancing, a boisterous, earthy kind of revelry. There are games, food stalls, and a general air of temporary escape from the daily grind. Here you might catch the eye of someone from a neighboring village. Perhaps your families are already acquainted, and a match is considered suitable. Your parents or other older relatives might facilitate a brief, chaperoned conversation. Young Agnes seems a sturdy lass. Good hips for childbearing, one father might observe to another. And your boy John looks like a hard worker, able to manage our adjoining fields if we were to come to an arrangement. It's all very romantic, isn't it? Almost makes you yearn for the days of awkward silences over lukewarm mead, while your respective uncles discuss dowry pigs. The concept of falling in love and then deciding to marry is, for many in this era, putting the cart before the horse, and a very unruly, unpredictable horse at that. The expectation is that you marry for sound reasons, and if you are fortunate, affection and companionship will develop over time. If not, you fulfill your duties, maintain the family honor, and perhaps seek emotional fulfillment elsewhere through piety, through friendships, or, if you're particularly daring and of a certain class, through the discreet, or not so discreeter, pursuit of courtly romance. Even the language used to describe relationships might feel different. Words like friendship, amicitia in Latin, could carry connotations of political alliance or kinship bonds as much as personal affection. Love itself was a complex concept, ranging from the spiritual love of God, agape or caritas, to the passionate, often dangerous, romantic love, more celebrated by the poets. Navigating these different forms of connection and understanding their appropriate place in your life was part of growing up in the medieval world. So, as you settle into this medieval mindset, try to shed your modern expectations. The path to finding a partner is not a journey of self-discovery through romantic trial and error. It is, more often than not, a carefully managed transition, a social contract designed to ensure order and continuity in a world that often felt chaotic and perilous. Your heart might yearn, your eyes might wander, but your destiny in matters of love and marriage is likely to be charted by older and supposedly wiser heads. The question isn't who do I choose, but rather who will choose for me, and for what purpose. It's a profoundly different starting point for one of life's most significant relationships, and it's from this starting point that all the rituals, customs, and negotiations of medieval courtship will unfold. Prepare yourself for the medieval dating scene, or rather, the medieval marriage market is a world away from anything you've known. You might even find yourself grateful for the algorithms, the awkward first dates, and the blessed freedom to make your own romantic mistakes. Or perhaps not. Perhaps there's a strange comfort in a world where some of life's biggest decisions are taken out of your inexperienced hands. Let's find out. You're beginning to get the picture, aren't you? This medieval world, so far removed from your own, operates on a different set of romantic, or perhaps more accurately, unromantic principles. The idea of leisurely dating, of exploring connections with a string of potential partners until your heart resonates like a well-strung lute, is, as we've established, about as common as a peasant. The path to partnership for the vast majority leads not through a series of candlelit dinners and shared confessions, but straight towards the rather more formidable institution of marriage. And this marriage, my dear time-traveling friend, is often less a meeting of souls and more a meticulously negotiated treaty. A strategic alliance where hearts are rarely the currency of choice. Forget romantic comedies. This is more like a high-stakes medieval version of Shark Tank, where families are the investors and you, the prospective bride or groom, are a key part of the deal. Let's delve deeper into this concept of marriage as a contract, particularly for the nobility and the aspiring merchant classes, those who had something tangible to gain or lose: land, wealth, power, influence. For them, choosing a spouse was one of the most critical decisions a family could make, with ramifications that could echo for generations. It was far too important to be left to the whims of inexperienced young people who might be swayed by something as frivolous as a handsome face, a melodious singing voice, or, heaven forbid, actual affection. No, this was a matter for sober heads, for careful calculation, for the weighing of assets and the forging of unbreakable bonds, or at least bonds that were intended to be unbreakable, though medieval divorce, or rather annulment, did exist, albeit often as a complex and politically charged affair, usually accessible only to the very powerful and well-connected. Imagine you are Lord Gilbert, a man of considerable, though perhaps not astronomical, standing. You have a daughter, Matilda, who has just reached marriageable age, which could be anywhere from 12 upwards, though consummation was often delayed. You also have a pesky neighbour, Baron Fitzwalter, whose lands conveniently adjoin yours, and with whom you've had a series of tiresome disputes over logging rights and stray sheep. What better way to resolve these tedious squabbles, and perhaps even gain a strategic advantage, than by marrying your Matilda to Fitzwalter's strapping, if somewhat dull-witted, son and heir, young Roger? The marriage contract, hammered out over many flagons of ale, and much poring over maps and deeds, would not only specify the dowry Matilda brings, a handsome sum of silver perhaps, or a prized piece of land further afield, but might also include clauses about mutual defence, shared access to that disputed forest, and an end to all sheep-related hostilities. Matilda's feelings about young Roger, who might have the conversational skills of a particularly taciturn turnip, are unlikely to feature prominently in these discussions. Her duty is to her family, to its prosperity and security. Her happiness is a secondary consideration, a private matter she must manage as best she can within the confines of her new life. This is the marriage market in action. Young men and women of the landed classes were, in essence, assets to be strategically deployed. A daughter with a substantial dowry could attract a powerful husband, elevating her family's status. A son could be married to an heiress, bringing new lands and wealth into the family coffers. It was a system designed to consolidate power, protect inheritances, and ensure the continuation of the lineage. A mainstream historical fact for you: the system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the bulk of the family estate, was common in many parts of medieval Europe, particularly among the nobility. This meant that younger sons often had to seek their fortunes elsewhere in the church, in military service, or by marrying an heiress. Daughters, unless they were heiresses themselves in the absence of male heirs, were valuable for the alliances their marriages could forge. The dowries they could command. The dowry itself was a critical component of these negotiations. It was the wealth in money, goods, or land that a bride brought to her husband's family upon marriage. It was intended to contribute to the support of the new household, and was a significant factor in determining a young woman's marriageability. A large dowry could compensate for a lack of beauty or noble birth, while a small one could limit even the most accomplished maiden's options. The negotiations over the dowry could be protracted and intense, a veritable tug-of-war between families, each trying to secure the best possible terms. It wasn't uncommon for betrothals to founder if the promised dowry failed to materialize or was deemed insufficient. You can almost picture the medieval equivalent of spreadsheets, with scribes carefully itemizing every silver spoon, every acre of pasture, every prize-winning sow that formed part of the marital package. It makes haggling over who pays for the wedding photographer seem positively quaint. Conversely, there was the concept of dower, or das, in Roman law traditions, which influenced some medieval practices. This was the portion of her husband's property that a wife was entitled to use for her support, should she be widowed. The dower rights were also often a subject of careful negotiation, in the marriage contract, ensuring that a woman would not be left destitute if her husband predeceased her, a very real possibility in an age of frequent warfare, disease, and generally shorter lifespans. The dower lands, often a third of the husband's estate, would revert to his heirs upon the widow's death, but during her lifetime they provided her with an income and a degree of independence. For a widow, her dower could make her a very attractive prospect for a second marriage, bringing with her not only her person, but also control over valuable resources. It's a reminder that women, even within this patriarchal system, were not always entirely without economic agency, though that agency was often tied to their marital status. Now, let's talk about the other primary product of these marital alliances: heirs. In a society obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and the continuation of the family name and estate, producing legitimate offspring, particularly male heirs, was paramount. A barren wife could be a cause for great distress, and sometimes even grounds for seeking an annulment, often disguised as a claim that the marriage was invalid due to some pre-existing impediment, like undisclosed consanguinity. The pressure on women to conceive and bear healthy children, especially sons, was immense. Their entire value, in the eyes of their husband's family, and sometimes even their own, could seem to rest upon their reproductive capacity. The birthing chamber was a place of both hope and profound danger, with maternal and infant mortality rates appallingly high by modern standards. Each successful birth, especially of a son, was a cause for celebration, securing the family's future. Each stillbirth or infant death was a tragedy, not just emotionally, but also dynastically. It's a heavy burden to place on any union, let alone one that might be devoid of personal affection from the outset. Consider the plight of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women of the Middle Ages. Her first marriage to King Louis VII of France produced 2 daughters but no sons. This lack of a male heir was a significant factor in the eventual annulment of their marriage. Her second marriage to Henry II of England was famously tempestuous but also incredibly fruitful, producing 5 sons including Richard the Lionheart and King John, and 3 daughters, securing the Plantagenet succession. Her story, while exceptional in its scale and drama, highlights the intense dynastic pressures surrounding royal and noble marriages. Your own, more modest medieval marriage would still carry echoes of this imperative: to provide heirs, to continue the line, to ensure that the lands and property accumulated by your ancestors passed safely into the hands of the next generation. It makes choosing a baby name seem like a walk in the park compared to the weight of securing a dynasty with your womb. So, where does love fit into all this? Was it entirely absent from medieval calculations of marriage? Not necessarily, but its role was often very different from what we expect today. While romantic love as the primary reason for marriage was rare, especially in the upper echelons of society, it wasn't entirely disregarded. Sometimes a degree of personal compatibility or even fledgling affection might be a welcome bonus if all the practical considerations also aligned. A father might be pleased if his daughter expressed a mild liking for her proposed husband, as it might promise a more harmonious household. But if she expressed a violent dislike, or worse, a preference for someone entirely unsuitable from a strategic point of view, her feelings would likely be overridden, gently or not so gently. Duty, obedience, and the good of the family trumped individual romantic inclinations. It was often hoped that love, or at least a solid companionable affection, would grow after the marriage. Shared experiences, the raising of children, the mutual management of a household and estate, these could forge strong bonds between a husband and wife, even if their union began as a purely pragmatic arrangement. There are medieval letters and documents that speak of deep affection and partnership between spouses, but there are also many that hint at indifference, discord, or quiet resignation. Historians still argue about the emotional texture of medieval marriages, with some emphasizing the pragmatic and often impersonal nature of these unions. while others point to evidence of genuine love, companionship, and emotional intimacy. The truth, as always, is likely complex and varied, differing from couple to couple, class to class, and region to region. For some, romantic and passionate love was sought and found outside the bonds of marriage. The entire tradition of courtly love, which we'll explore in more detail later, often revolved around the idealized chivalrous devotion of a knight to a noble lady who's almost invariably married to someone else. This love was typically portrayed as ennobling, inspiring great deeds and artistic expression. But it was also often unconsummated and fraught with tension, existing in a realm separate from the practicalities of marriage and procreation. This clear distinction between love and marriage can seem jarring to us, raised as many of us are on the ideal of the love match, where romantic passion is seen as the essential foundation for a lifelong commitment. But in the medieval mindset, this separation could be quite normal. Marriage was for family, for property, for heirs. Love, in its more intense, passionate form, was a different beast altogether. Sometimes a delightful indulgence, sometimes a dangerous folly, but not typically the bedrock of your average Tuesday night with the spouse and kids. A quirky tidbit for you. In some medieval romance literature, you find tales of love potions or magical interventions designed to spark affection between reluctant spouses or to win the heart of an unattainable beloved. While these are literary tropes, they perhaps reflect a certain yearning for love within a system that often sidelined it, a fantastical wish fulfillment for emotional connection in a world governed by pragmatic contracts. It's the medieval equivalent of hoping a dating app algorithm will magically deliver your soulmate, only with more eye of newt and less swiping. The merchant classes in burgeoning towns and cities also approached marriage with a keen eye for practical advantage, though their assets were more likely to be trade connections, craft skills, or liquid capital, rather than vast landed estates. A wool merchant might seek to marry his daughter to the son of a draper, creating a vertically integrated family business. A skilled artisan might take a wife whose dowry could help him expand his workshop or buy into a guild. Love might be a factor, perhaps more so than among the high nobility, as personal choice could sometimes play a bigger role if economic needs were met. But financial security and the advancement of the family enterprise were still paramount. The marriage bed was often, quite literally, an extension of the counting house or the workshop, even for the peasantry, who constituted the vast majority of the population and had little land or wealth to negotiate over. Marriage was still a serious economic undertaking. A peasant needed a wife who was strong, healthy, and capable of sharing the heavy burden of agricultural labor, as well as bearing and raising children who would, in turn, contribute to the family's survival. A woman looked for a husband who had access to land, even if it was just a small plot rented from the lord, a pair of sturdy oxen, or a skill that could provide for a family. While personal attraction and affection likely played a greater role in peasant marriages simply because there were fewer external pressures from high politics or large inheritances, the fundamental need for a partner who could contribute to the household economy was inescapable. A good pair of working hands and a strong back could be just as attractive as a pretty face or a charming wit when your survival depended on the next harvest. The true price of medieval marriage, then, was often the subordination of individual desire to the collective needs of the family and society. It was a system that prized stability, continuity, and the orderly transfer of property above all else. It could be a source of security and social cohesion, but it could also be a source of profound personal frustration and unhappiness for those whose hearts yearned for something more, something different. As you, our medieval persona, contemplate your own marital prospects, you are acutely aware that you are not just choosing a life partner. You are entering into a complex web of obligations, expectations, and material considerations that will shape your entire existence. The stakes are incredibly high, and the game is played by rules that often have very little to do with love as you might understand it. It's a world where I do often means I do agree to this carefully constructed socio-economic arrangement for the betterment of our respective lineages. And I hope we learn to tolerate each other. Sweet dreams, indeed. So, you're beginning to understand the medieval marriage game, aren't you? It's less about hearts and flowers and more about hectares and heifers, especially if you're navigating the upper echelons of society. Remember Lord Gilbert and Baron Fitzwalter, sorting out their logging disputes and sheep-related squabbles by marrying off poor Matilda to the turnip-like Roger. It's a world where your spouse is often chosen with the same cool calculation you might use to pick a reliable plow horse, strong, from good stock, and unlikely to cause too much trouble. But amidst this landscape of pragmatic alliances and dynastic ambitions, another, far more glittering and ethereal concept of love began to shimmer, particularly in the refined courts of southern France and beyond, starting around the 12th century. This, my friend, is the realm of courtly love, a world of chivalrous knights, idealized ladies, poetic devotion, and a rule book for romance so complex it would make modern dating coaches weep into their self-help manuals. Imagine yourself for a moment, no longer the dutiful child contemplating a strategically advantageous but emotionally barren marriage. Instead, you are transported to a vibrant, sophisticated court, perhaps in Aquitaine or Champagne. The air here is not so thick with the smell of manure and boiled cabbage. Instead, there are hints of exotic spices, of beeswax candles, of fine woolen cloth, and perhaps the faint, alluring scent of perfume, a rare luxury. Minstrels or troubadours pluck at harps and lutes, their voices weaving intricate melodies and even more intricate verses about the exquisite torment and transcendent joy of fin amour, or fine love, as they called it. This is a world where love is not a mundane domestic arrangement, but an art form, a spiritual quest, a code of conduct that could elevate the soul and inspire breathtaking acts of heroism. Or, at least, that was the theory. It's like stepping out of a very sensible, slightly dull arranged marriage seminar and straight into the most over-the-top, beautifully produced, romantic opera you can imagine. So, what exactly was this courtly love that had poets swooning and knights supposedly performing ridiculous feats of daring? It wasn't a single neatly defined doctrine, but rather a set of literary conventions and aristocratic ideals that celebrated a particular kind of romantic devotion. At its heart was the knight, the chivalrous warrior, who pledged his unwavering service and adoration to a noble lady. This lady was typically of high rank, often already married to someone else, usually a powerful lord, conveniently busy with important lordly things like warring or hunting, and portrayed as the epitome of beauty, virtue, and grace. She was, in essence, placed on a pedestal so high you'd get vertigo just looking up at her. The knight's love for her was meant to be ennobling. Her very existence, her merest glance, was supposed to inspire him to be braver, more courteous, more eloquent, more everything a perfect knight should be. His love was a service, a kind of feudal devotion, where he was her vassal, and she his beloved, unattainable suzerain. A mainstream historical fact to anchor this: the development of courtly love is often associated with the courts of powerful and cultured noblewomen like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, her again, she gets around in medieval history, being rather important, and her daughter Marie, Countess of Champagne. These aristocratic circles became centers for the cultivation of vernacular poetry and romance literature, where troubadours and trouvères, their northern French counterparts, composed and performed songs and poems celebrating these new ideals of love. Works like Andreas Capellanus's late 12th century treatise, De Amore, the Art of Courtly Love, attempted to codify some of its rules and principles, though it's a text that continues to spark debate among scholars. Is it a serious guide, a satirical cool parody, or a bit of both? The love celebrated in this tradition was often, and importantly, characterized by its difficulty, its secrecy, and its frequently unrequited or unconsummated nature. The lady was an object of distant adoration. The knight suffered an exquisite agony of longing, his passion fueled by her very unattainability. This suffering was seen as a refining fire, purging him of base desires and elevating him to a higher spiritual plane. He would compose poems extolling her virtues, wear her colors, or a token, perhaps a glove, or a ribbon in tournaments, and perform valorous deeds in her name, all in the hope of winning a smile, a kind word, or some small sign of her favor. It's the ultimate long-distance relationship, often conducted with someone who might not even know you're in a relationship with them, or who is very much in a very binding, land and air-based relationship with someone else. Talk about mixed signals. The rituals and expressions of courtly love could be incredibly elaborate. Secrecy was paramount, adding to the thrill and the perceived preciousness of the affair. Lovers might communicate through coded messages, use go-betweens, or meet in clandestine locations like secluded gardens or hidden bowers, all very Romeo and Juliet, before Romeo and Juliet even existed, though their love, while secret, was decidedly their love. While secret was decidedly consummated and less about ennobling service and more about teenage hormones. But you get the idea. The language of courtly love was rich with metaphor and allegory. The lover was a prisoner of love, wounded by Cupid's arrow, consumed by a sweet sickness. His lady was his star, his goddess, his cure. The poetry is full of sighs, tears, sleepless nights. Our old friend insomnia makes a star appearance here too, but this time it's fashionably romantic and declarations of undying devotion. It's like an entire genre of medieval emo, only with more chainmail and fewer strategically floppy haircuts. One of the central tenets was that true love, this fin amour, could only exist outside of marriage. Andreas Capellanus famously declared in one of his rules of love that marriage is no real excuse for not loving. This seems incredibly counterintuitive to our modern sensibilities, where love is often seen as the primary justification for marriage. But remember those pragmatic medieval marriages we discussed? They were about property, lineage, and social order. Courtly love, in contrast, was about individual emotion, about a freely chosen on the knight's part, at least devotion that transcended such worldly concerns. The very fact that the lady was usually married to someone else added to the delicious frisson of forbidden desire and heightened the spiritual value of the knight's chaste or supposedly chaste adoration. It was a love that was, by its very nature, often adulterous in spirit, if not always indeed. This, of course, put it in direct conflict with the teachings of the Church, which condemned adultery in no uncertain terms. This tension between the ideals of courtly love and religious doctrine is one of its most fascinating and debated aspects. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. Some of the rules outlined by Andreas Capellanus are quite specific and rather amusing to modern ears. For example, he who is not jealous cannot love, or a true lover is constantly and without intermission possessed by the thought of his beloved. Another delightful one is, when a lover suddenly catches sight of his beloved, his heart palpitates. No kidding, Andreas, that's just basic human physiology when you fancy someone. But thanks for codifying it. There were even mock courts of love, supposedly presided over by noble women like Marie de Champagne, where difficult questions or disputes about love would be debated and judged according to these elaborate rules. It's like a medieval agony ant column combined with a Supreme Court, all dedicated to the minutiae of unrequited pining. But how much of this was real, and how much was a sophisticated literary game, a form of aristocratic entertainment? This is where historians still argue. Was courtly love a genuine social code that influenced the behavior of knights and ladies, leading to actual clandestine affairs and elaborate rituals of devotion? Or was it primarily a set of themes and conventions explored in poetry and romance, a way for a leisured class to explore complex emotions and ideals in a fictionalized setting. The evidence is ambiguous. The literature is certainly full of it. But how far these literary portrayals reflected or shaped actual social practice is much harder to determine. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a fashionable ideal that some tried to emulate in their own lives, while for others it remained a pleasant fiction, a way to add a touch of glamour and romance to a world that was often harsh and unyielding. It's possible that for many it was like modern celebrity culture, something to be avidly consumed and discussed, but not necessarily something that directly impacted their day-to-day relationships. Certainly, the ideals of chivalry, which became closely intertwined with courtly love, did have a tangible impact on the knightly class. The notion that a knight should be brave, courteous, loyal, and protective of the weak, especially ladies, was a powerful shaping force. And if his devotion to a particular lady inspired him to uphold these chivalric virtues more rigorously, then courtly love could be seen as having a positive social function, at least within that elite context. Tournaments, for example, became occasions not just for martial display, but also for knights to win the favor of their chosen ladies, dedicating their victories to them and wearing their tokens. It was a way of channeling aggressive masculine energy into a more refined and controlled form of social performance. Think of it as a medieval X Games, only with more poetry and slightly less concern for concussion protocols. However, the potential for hypocrisy and self-deception was enormous. A knight might profess undying, chaste devotion to his lady, while simultaneously pursuing less idealized pleasures elsewhere. A lady might enjoy the flattery and attention of her adoring knight, while remaining firmly committed to the security and status of her marriage. And the whole edifice, with its emphasis on suffering and longing, could easily tip over into a kind of fashionable melancholy, or even genuine emotional distress. One imagines quite a few medieval nobles sighing dramatically by mullioned windows, composing terrible poetry, and generally being a bit of a trial to their long-suffering spouses, who just wanted them to pass the salt or discuss the leaky castle roof. Furthermore, courtly love was, by its very nature, an exclusive club. It was primarily a phenomenon of the aristocracy, of those who had the leisure and education to appreciate its subtleties and participate in its rituals. The peasant toiling in the fields, or the artisan in his workshop, had little time or opportunity for such refined emotional gymnastics. Their concerns were more immediate: survival, sustenance, the next harvest, the next rent payment, while they undoubtedly experienced love, passion, and heartbreak in their own ways. The elaborate codes and literary expressions of courtly love were largely outside their world. Their love stories, if recorded at all, are found less in shimmering romances and more in the rather more prosaic records of village courts or church cunsteries, dealing with broken marriage promises, illicit liaisons, and the everyday dramas of ordinary lives. The church, as you might imagine, had a rather ambivalent relationship with courtly love. On one hand, any ideal that encouraged chastity, self-discipline, and spiritual aspiration could be seen as positive. The veneration of the Virgin Mary, which grew enormously in popularity during the High Middle Ages, shared some superficial similarities with the idealization of the lady in courtly love. Both involved a pure, devoted, and often distant adoration. However, the adulterous undertones of much courtly love literature, its focus on earthly passion, however refined, and its potential to distract from the proper love of God and the duties of Christian marriage, were deeply problematic for ecclesiastical authorities. Clerics often railed against the vanities and dangers of romantic love, urging the faithful to focus on spiritual matters and the sanctity of matrimony as ordained by God. So, while the poets were singing of languishing for their ladies, the priests were often preaching about the perils of such worldly attachments. It created a fascinating cultural tension, a dialogue between the sacred and the secular, the ideal and the pragmatic. For you, as a medieval noble, Navigating this world of courtly love, alongside the hard realities of your arranged marriage, would require a delicate balancing act. Perhaps you are a young knight, eager to prove your worth, and you fix your adoration upon a beautiful, high-ranking married lady at court. You learn the poems, you practice the gestures, you strive to embody the chivalric ideal in her honor. It gives your life a sense of purpose, a romantic glamour. But you must also remember your duties to your own lord, your own family, and perhaps eventually to your own pragmatically chosen wife. Or perhaps you are that noble lady, flattered by the attentions of a devoted young knight, enjoying the game of courtly flirtation, but keenly aware of the boundaries, the dangers, and the ultimate loyalty you owe to your husband and your lineage. However unromantic that bond might be, it's a complex dance of emotion, convention, and self-preservation. The influence of courtly love, despite its eventual decline as a dominant literary and social mode, was profound and long-lasting. It helped to shape Western conceptions of romantic love, introducing ideas of courtesy, devotion, and the ennobling power of passion that still resonate in our culture today. The figure of the chivalrous knight, the quest for an idealized beloved, the notion that love involves a degree of suffering and service. These tropes have been endlessly replayed and reinvented in literature, art, and film. So even though you, in your 21st century life, are unlikely to joust for your beloved's favor or compose a sonnet sequence detailing your exquisite romantic agony unless you're really committed to a theme party, the echoes of this medieval ideal are still there, whispering in the background of our modern romantic landscape. It's the ancestor of every grand romantic gesture, every love song about pining, every movie where the hero declares, "She makes me want to be a better man." It just came with more restrictive underwear and a higher chance of dying from a festering wound. So, you've had a glimpse into the glittering, often frustratingly unattainable, world of courtly love, where knights sighed poetically and ladies presided over imaginary courts of love, all while their actual marriages were likely being managed with the cold precision of a master chess player. It's a captivating diversion, this idea of love as an ennobling art form. But for most people, including you, our medieval time traveler, the path to a lifelong partnership didn't usually involve composing sonnets to a married duchess. No, it navigated a much more formal, legally binding, and family-orchestrated route. The process of betrothal. Forget the spontaneous, tearful proposal on bended knee under a moonlit sky. Medieval betrothal was more often a carefully staged public declaration, a binding contract that set the wheels of marriage firmly, and often irrevocably, in motion. After all the hushed negotiations between families that we explored earlier, the haggling over dowries, the strategic assessment of alliances, the careful consideration of lineage and property, the moment would eventually arrive to make the agreement official. This wasn't just a casual "so, are we doing this?" conversation. A betrothal, or sponsalia, as it was known in Latin, was a serious and often public commitment recognized by both society and the increasingly powerful church. It was the medieval equivalent of signing a legally binding contract, only instead of a merger between two companies, it was a merger between two families, with you and your intended as the principal clauses. No pressure, right? Now, the medieval church, particularly after the reforms of the 12th century and the work of canon lawyers like Gratian, whose Decretum Gratiani became a foundational text of church law, distinguished between two types of betrothal, and this distinction is rather crucial. First, there was sponsalia de futuro, which was essentially a promise to marry in the future. It was an agreement, often made by the families when the prospective bride and groom were still children, that a marriage would take place at a later date. Think of it as a pre-prenup, an early reservation in the grand hotel of matrimony. While it was a serious undertaking, a sponsalia de futuro could, under certain circumstances, be dissolved especially if it hadn't been followed by any physical consummation, which, if the parties were children, it most certainly wouldn't have been. However, the second type, sponsalia de presenti, was a much weightier affair. This was a vow of betrothal made in words of the present tense: I take you, Agnes, as my wife, and I take you, John, as my husband. A mainstream historical fact for you. According to canon law, if a man and a woman freely and with intent exchange such vows of present consent, even without witnesses or a priest present, they were considered truly and validly married in the eyes of the Church. This is a rather astonishing concept to us, accustomed as we are to licensed officiants, signed certificates, and often elaborate public ceremonies. But for the medieval Church, the core of the sacrament of marriage lay in the free consent of the two individuals. Of course, proving such a private exchange of vows could be incredibly difficult if one party later denied it, which is why public betrothals and church weddings became increasingly encouraged and eventually, in many places, required for a marriage to be fully recognized by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Imagine yourself, Lady Matilda, now perhaps a young woman of 15, standing in the great hall of your father's castle. The torches flicker, casting dancing shadows on the tapestries that depict heroic and probably highly embellished deeds of your ancestors. Your father, Lord Gilbert, stands beside you, his hand perhaps resting a little too firmly on your shoulder. Opposite you stands young Roger Fitzwalter, looking, if possible, even more turnip-like than you remembered, flanked by his own formidable father, Baron Fitzwalter. Various family members, retainers, and perhaps a local priest or notary are gathered as witnesses. The air is thick with expectation, and probably the smell of nervous sweat and damp wool. The words of betrothal would be spoken. If it's a formal sponsalia de futuro because you're still deemed a little young for the full shebang, your father might do most of the talking, promising your hand to Roger at some specified future date, or when you reach a certain age. But if this is the more serious sponsalia de presenti, then you and Roger would be expected to speak the vows yourselves. I, Matilda, take thee, Roger, to my wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us do part. Well, maybe not those exact words, the precise formula could vary. In the famous Anglican Book of Common Prayer version is later, but the sentiment, the binding promise in the present tense, would be there. You might have to repeat the words after a priest, your voice a small trembling thing in the vast echoing hall. You might try to catch Roger's eye, searching for some flicker of something. Kindness? Terror? Mutual resignation? He's probably just wondering when the feast starts. This exchange of vows, this public declaration, was what transformed a negotiated agreement into a recognized betrothal. It was a performative act. The words themselves had power, and witnesses were crucial, especially to prevent later disputes. Their presence confirmed that the vows had been freely spoken, even if freely was a rather flexible concept when your entire family's future and fortune were at stake, and that the union was therefore legitimate. Historians still argue about the true extent of individual consent, particularly for women, in these betrothal ceremonies. While the Church insisted on free consent as a prerequisite for a valid marriage, the social and familial pressures on young people, especially daughters, to agree to a match chosen for them were often immense. Outright refusal could bring shame upon the family, disrupt carefully laid plans, and even result in harsh consequences for the disobedient individual. So was that murmured, "I do truly free," or was it often an acceptance of the inevitable, a bowing to duty and expectation? It's a question that complicates our understanding of medieval agency. Once betrothed, especially de presenti, you were, for all intents and purposes, married in the eyes of God and the Church. Even if the public wedding celebration and the bedding ceremony, the formal public putting to bed of the couple, often witnessed by family and friends to signify consummation, were yet to occur. This period between the betrothal and the formal church wedding could vary in length. Sometimes it was short, a matter of weeks or months. Sometimes, especially if the betrothal involved very young children, child marriages, though frowned upon by some reformers, did occur, particularly among royalty and high nobility for dynastic reasons. It could last for many years. During this time the couple were bound to each other. They could not enter into another betrothal or a marriage contract. To do so would be a serious offense, a form of bigamy. The church played an increasingly active role in regulating and validating these unions. Before a marriage could be formally solemnized in church, it was common practice for the banns to be read. This involved announcing the intended marriage publicly in the parish church on 3 successive Sundays or holy days. The purpose of reading the banns was to give anyone in the community an opportunity to come forward if they knew of any lawful impediment to the marriage, for example. If one of the parties was already married or betrothed to someone else, or if they were too closely related by blood consanguinity or by marriage affinity. The church had complex rules defining prohibited degrees of kinship, and uncovering such an impediment could render the proposed marriage invalid. Imagine the potential for village drama. The banns are being read for young Thomas and Agnes, and suddenly old widow McGillicuddy pipes up from the back pew. "Hold on a moment, Vicar! Isn't young Thomas the third cousin, twice removed, of Agnes's stepmother's former husband's aunt? I reckon that puts them within the forbidden degrees." Cue much frantic consulting of genealogical charts and canonical lawyers. It was like a medieval episode of Who Do You Think You Are? With much higher stakes. Gifts were often exchanged at the time of betrothal, serving as tangible symbols of the agreement and the affection real or hoped for between the couple and their families. The man might give his betrothed a ring, often a simple band of gold or silver, to be worn as a sign of their commitment. This is one of the ancient roots of our modern engagement ring tradition. Other gifts might include clothing, jewels, prayer books, or even livestock or land, depending on the social status of the families involved. These weren't just sentimental tokens, they could also have legal significance, reinforcing the reality of the contract. If the betrothal were to be broken, which was difficult but not impossible, especially for sponsalia de futuro, if just cause could be shown, there might be disputes over the return of these gifts. It's the medieval version of arguing over who gets to keep the Netflix subscription after a breakup, only with more valuable assets, like a prize-winning bowl or a nicely illuminated psalter. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. Sometimes, specific symbolic objects were used in betrothal ceremonies. For instance, a knife might be broken in two, with each partner keeping half, symbolizing their union and the idea that they would only be whole when joined together. Or a couple might drink from a shared cup, signifying their future shared life. These folk customs, varying by region, added layers of meaning and tradition to the formal vows. Some also believed in auspicious or inauspicious days for betrothals or weddings, consulting almanacs or local wise women at their peril. If the church disapproved, to ensure the stars were favorably aligned for their union. You wouldn't want to get betrothed on a day when Mercury was in retrograde and the village goat looked particularly grumpy. That would just be asking for trouble. The period between the betrothal and the wedding ceremony was a liminal time. The couple were committed, but not yet living together as husband and wife. Depending on their age and social circumstances, their interactions might still be somewhat formal and supervised. However, the public acknowledgement of their impending union would allow for a slightly greater degree of familiarity than before. They might be seated together at feasts or allowed to converse more freely, though still probably within earshot of a vigilant aunt or duenna. For those betrothed as children, this period was one of growing up, of preparing for their future roles as husband and wife, often in separate households, only to be brought together when they reached an appropriate age for the marriage to be fully enacted. Breaking a betrothal was not a light matter. As we've seen, a betrothal de presenti was considered a true marriage. To repudiate such a vow was tantamount to seeking an annulment, which required proving that some fundamental impediment had existed at the time the vows were made, e.g. coercion, a pre-existing valid marriage, or being within the prohibited degrees of kinship without a proper dispensation. For a sponsalia de futuro, there was a little more leeway, but even then, a valid reason was usually required, such as misconduct by one of the parties, the discovery of a serious disease, or a long and unexplained absence. Simply changing one's mind or falling in love with someone else, remember those pesky courtly love ideals, was generally not considered sufficient grounds, especially if significant financial or political arrangements were tied to the match. There could be lawsuits, demands for the return of dowry or gifts, and considerable social scandal if a betrothal was broken without just cause. Families had invested their reputation and resources in the match, and they would not take kindly to its dissolution. So for you, our medieval protagonist, the betrothal ceremony is a pivotal moment. It's the point of no return, or at least the point from which a return is exceedingly difficult and fraught with peril. As you stand there, perhaps feeling the weight of your family's expectations, the solemnity of the vows, and the unknown future stretching before you, you are acutely aware that your individual life is now inextricably bound to another. Another family. There might be a sense of fear, of resignation, perhaps even a flicker of hope if your intended seems kind, or your families are genuinely pleased with the match. But overwhelmingly, there would be a sense of duty fulfilled, of a necessary step taken in the complex dance of medieval social survival. The binding ties of betrothal are now firmly in place, and the next act in your life's drama, the wedding ceremony, and the commencement of your married life is about to begin. The confetti, if they had it, would be less about celebrating romantic love and more about celebrating a successfully concluded socio-economic contract. And you'd just be hoping your new spouse doesn't snore like a dragon, or have an unfortunate habit of collecting toenails. Small mercies, right? So, the binding vows of betrothal have been spoken, perhaps in the echoing grandeur of your father's hall, or maybe with slightly less pomp, but no less significance before the church porch. Those words, as we've seen, carry immense weight, tying you, our medieval time traveler, to another soul, and more importantly, to another family, in a contract that's notoriously difficult to unwind. But words, however solemn, can sometimes feel intangible, easily lost on the wind, or misremembered in the mists of time. To give these promises a more concrete form, to seal the deal with something you could touch, see, and perhaps even flaunt a little, medieval society relied heavily on another ancient practice: the giving and receiving of gifts. These weren't just casual afterthoughts, no medieval equivalent of a hastily bought box of chocolates from the all-night apothecary. These tokens and treasured presents were an integral part of the courtship and betrothal dance, a complex language of love, obligation, status, and strategic intent. Imagine, after the formalities of your betrothal to young Roger Fitzwalter, yes, him again, try to look enthusiastic, a moment when gifts are exchanged. It's not quite like a modern engagement party where everyone oohs and ahs over a diamond ring the size of a small bird's egg. But the principle is similar. An object passes from one hand to another, signifying a promise, an investment, and a shift in relationship. These gifts could range from the exquisitely crafted and eye-wateringly expensive, if you're in Lady Matilda's silken slippers, to the touchingly simple and handmade, if you're from a more humble background. But regardless of their monetary value, they were laden with meaning. Perhaps the most iconic and enduring symbol of betrothal, then as now, was the ring. A plain gold or silver band was common, its circular form representing eternity. An unbroken bond, a rather optimistic sentiment given the medieval lifespan and the often pragmatic nature of the union, but a lovely idea nonetheless. Sometimes these rings were inscribed with mottos or posies, short sentimental phrases like "Mon cœur," "Have as you have my heart," or "Amor vincit omnia," "Love conquers." Although medieval families might have wryly substituted property conquers all. Fader rings, depicting two hands clasped together in faith or trust, were also popular, a clear visual representation of the joining of two individuals or two families. For the wealthier echelons, rings might be set with gemstones, and each stone was believed to possess particular properties and symbolism. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval lapidaries' books describing the virtues and powers of gems were widely read. For example, a sapphire might signify truth and constancy useful in a marriage, a ruby might represent passion or nobility, and an emerald could symbolize hope or fertility. So the choice of stone wasn't just about what looked pretty. It could carry a very specific message. Your betrothal ring from Roger might be a solid, dependable gold band, perhaps with a small, rather uninspiring garnet. You'd try to convince yourself the garnet stands for deep and abiding affection, not just the fact that his father got a good deal on a job lot from a passing merchant. Beyond rings, clothing and textiles were highly valued gifts, especially luxurious or finely worked items. Remember, in an age before mass-produced fashion, good quality fabric was a significant investment, and a garment made from silk, velvet, or fine wool, perhaps embroidered with gold or silver thread, was a serious statement of wealth and status. A prospective groom might present his betrothed with a beautiful gown, or the materials to make one. This wasn't just a nice gesture. It was also a way of demonstrating his ability to provide for her and to ensure she would appear suitably attired as his future wife, reflecting well on his own standing. Conversely, a bride's trousseau, the collection of clothing, linens, and other personal possessions she brought to the marriage, often including gifts from her own family, was a crucial part of her contribution, displayed with pride. You might receive a length of rich blue brocade from Roger's family, a color often associated with fidelity and conveniently, a color that looks rather well on you, even if Roger himself remains a sartorial black hole in his sensible brown waist. Girdles or ornamental belts were another common and highly symbolic gift, particularly from a man to a woman. These could be incredibly ornate, made of leather, silk, or even woven metal threads, often adorned with jeweled buckles or decorative plaques. A girdle was worn around the waist or hips, a very visible accessory, and its acceptance could signify a woman's acceptance of the man's suit. There was also a certain intimacy implied as it encircled the body. Some girdles even had little bells or pendants that would jingle musically as the wearer moved, a not-so-subtle announcement of her betrothed status. You can imagine Lady Matilda receiving a rather splendid silver gilt girdle, hoping it doesn't clang quite so loudly that everyone in the castle knows her every move. It's the medieval equivalent of changing your relationship status on social media, only far more jingly and less easily undone. Smaller, more personal items also played their part in this gift-giving dance. An ivory comb, a small silver-backed glass mirrors were still rare and expensive. A finely tooled leather purse, or a beautifully illuminated prayer book or book of hours, if you were literate and pious, or at least wanted to appear so, could it all be exchanged as tokens of affection or esteem. These items were often used daily, keeping the giver in the thoughts of the recipient. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some medieval love tokens could be quite intimate or even slightly bizarre by our standards. For example, a knight in a romance might treasure a single hair from his lady's head, or even a vial of her tears, as a sacred relic. While these are literary exaggerations, they hint at the intensity of feeling that could be invested in even the smallest personal token. You probably wouldn't want a vial of Roger Fitzwalter's tears, though. They'd likely just smell faintly of turnip. For high-status marriages, the gifts exchanged could be far more substantial, blurring the lines with the dowry and dower settlements we've already discussed. A powerful lord might gift his future son-in-law a strategically important castle, a herd of prize cattle, or the rights to collect revenues from a particular village. These weren't just tokens, they were significant transfers of wealth and power, cementing the alliance between the families. The giving of such gifts would be a public and ceremonial affair, witnessed by important members of both families and their retainers, further underscoring the binding nature of the agreement. It's a bit like when tech billionaires gift each other entire islands, only with more feudal obligations and fewer opportunities for tax write-offs. The symbolism behind these gifts was often multi-layered. On one level, they were a display of wealth and status. The more lavish the gift, the more powerful and important the giver and, by extension, the recipient. They were also, of course, intended to foster goodwill and affection, or at least a sense of mutual obligation between the two families. Even in the most pragmatic of arranged marriages, a thoughtful or valuable gift could help to smooth the path, to create a sense of anticipation or even gratitude in the recipient. And, as mentioned with the gemstones and inscriptions, gifts could carry specific messages of love, fidelity, hope, or piety. They were a way of communicating emotions and intentions in a society where direct verbal expressions of affection, especially between unmarried individuals, might be considered improper or premature. The gift did the talking. Historians still argue about the extent to which these gifts reflected genuine personal affection versus purely formal or strategic considerations. In some cases, particularly in matches between powerful families where the bride and groom might barely know each other, the gifts were undoubtedly part of the elaborate political and economic ritual, chosen for their value and impact rather than any deep personal sentiment. However, it's also likely that even within these arranged unions, individuals might try to imbue the gifts with some personal meaning, or that gifts exchanged later in the betrothal period, as the couple became more acquainted, might carry more genuine emotional weight. And in less formal courtships, or among those with a little more freedom to choose, a gift could indeed be a heartfelt expression of burgeoning love, a precious token chosen with care and given with a hopeful heart. The meaning was often in the eye of the beholder, or perhaps more accurately, in the context of the specific relationship. Now, how did these gifts differ from those exchanged in the rarefied atmosphere of courtly love? There were overlaps, certainly. A knight might give his idealized lady a ring or a jeweled girdle as a sign of his devotion. But courtly love gifts were often characterized by their extreme chivalric symbolism and their connection to the lady's service. A knight might receive a sleeve or a pennant from his lady to wear in a tournament, a token that publicly proclaimed his allegiance and inspired him to acts of valor. These gifts were less about sealing a marital contract and more about fueling a supposedly ennobling, often unrequited, passion. The gifts given in the context of betrothal, while they could be romanticized, were ultimately tied to the very real and legally binding prospect of marriage. One was about idealized yearning, the other about impending domesticity. You wouldn't expect Roger Fitzwalter to fight a dragon for you because you gave him your second-best handkerchief. He's more likely to use it to wipe ale off his chin. Did women also give gifts to their betrothed? Yes, though perhaps less frequently or less lavishly documented than gifts from men to women, which often formed part of the bride price or dowry considerations in a broader sense. A lady might embroider a purse or a banner for her intended, a highly personal gift showcasing her skill and devotion. She might give him a small devotional object or a lock of her hair if they were aiming for that courtly love vibe within a betrothal context. These gifts, while perhaps less economically significant than those given by the groom's family, still played an important role in the reciprocal language of courtship and commitment. They signified her acceptance of the match and her willingness to enter into the new relationship. The legal implications of these betrothal gifts could also be significant. If a betrothal was broken, especially if it was deemed to be without just cause, the question of whether gifts should be returned could become a contentious issue, sometimes even leading to legal disputes in ecclesiastical or secular courts. Generally, if the betrothal was dissolved due to the fault of one party, that party might forfeit any gifts received, and be obliged to return those given by the innocent party. It was all part of the complex legal and social framework surrounding these binding promises. So, if you, Lady Matilda, decided you simply couldn't face a lifetime with turnip-like Roger and tried to call the whole thing off, you might find yourself not only in hot water with your father, but also embroiled in a messy dispute over that rather nice silver-gilt girdle. The presentation and display of these gifts were also important. A valuable betrothal gift wasn't usually just handed over casually. It might be presented formally in front of witnesses as part of the betrothal ceremony itself, or at a subsequent feast. This public display reinforced the seriousness of the commitment and allowed both families to showcase their generosity and status. The gifts became part of the visible evidence of the alliance being forged. You can imagine the oohs and ahs, or perhaps polite, restrained nods of approval as a particularly fine jewel or a richly embroidered cloak was presented. It was all part of theater of medieval social life, where every gesture, every object could be laden with meaning and significance. So, as you navigate your medieval betrothal, these gifts are more than just pretty trinkets or useful objects. They are a tangible manifestation of the complex web of relationships, obligations, and aspirations that define your path to marriage. They speak of family strategy, of social standing, of legal contracts, and sometimes, just sometimes, of a quiet, burgeoning affection. Each ring, each piece of cloth, each carefully chosen token tells a story. A story of two families intertwining their destinies with you and your betrothed at the very heart of the exchange. Whether your heart flutters at the sight of Roger's rather predictable gift of a sturdy woolen shawl, or whether you're secretly hoping he'll trip over his own feet and accidentally betroth himself to a passing milkmaid instead, these gifts are now part of your story, part of the price and the promise of your medieval marriage. Handle them with care. They are heavier with meaning than they appear. The gifts have been exchanged, those tangible symbols of your impending union. Perhaps, Lady Matilda, you're now sporting that rather substantial silver-gilt girdle from young Roger Fitzwalter. Its little bells subtly announcing your betrothed status with every rustle of your kirtle. Or maybe, if you're from a more modest background, you're treasuring a simple wooden spice box carved by your intended. It sent a faint promise of shared meals to come. These tokens, as we've seen, speak a language of their own, conveying messages of alliance, status, and perhaps even a whisper of affection. But what about actual face-to-face interaction? After the betrothal vows are made and the presents unwrapped, how do you, our medieval couple-to-be, actually get to know each other? Or at least tolerate each other, or at least tolerate each other's, before the wedding bells, or more likely, the somewhat less melodious clang of the local church bell officially seal your fate? If you're picturing romantic walks in the moonlight or cozy evenings spent sharing your deepest hopes and dreams, well, you might need to adjust your medieval Instagram filter. The reality for most, especially those of the noble or aspiring merchant classes, was that unchaperoned, private time between a betrothed or even just potentially marriageable young man and woman was about as common as a vegetarian dragon. Reputation, particularly a young woman's honor, was a fragile and fiercely guarded commodity. Any suggestion of impropriety, any hint of unsupervised intimacy, could be catastrophic, jeopardizing not just her own marriage prospects, but also her family's standing in the community. Society was a web of watchful eyes and wagging tongues, and the concept of minding your own business hadn't quite caught on when it came to the moral conduct of its members. Therefore, most interactions between the sexes, especially if they were unmarried and of marriageable age, took place under a fairly constant and often stifling blanket of supervision. So where might you even encounter your future spouse, or someone your family is vaguely considering as future spouse material? The venues were often public, or at least semi-public and structured. Think of grand feasts in the castle hall, perhaps celebrating a religious festival, or a significant family event, like another wedding, a prime opportunity for matchmaking. Then, as now, you might find yourself seated near your betrothed, or at least in the same vast, noisy room, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat, spilled wine, and the boisterous conversation of 100 guests. Here, under the gaze of countless relatives and retainers, you might exchange a few polite, carefully chosen words. The swan is most excellently prepared, is it not, Lady Matilda? Roger might venture, his mouth full. You'd agree, perhaps commenting on the sweetness of the hippocras, all the while acutely aware of your mother's eagle eye from 3 seats down, or Roger's father loudly discussing crop yields with your own sire. It's not exactly conducive to deep, meaningful connection, more like trying to have a heart-to-heart in the middle of a very loud, medieval food court. Church services and religious festivals provided another key opportunity for interaction, or at least for sanctioned proximity. The entire community would gather for Mass on Sundays and important feast days. You might walk in procession, catch a glimpse of your intended across the nave, or even kneel near them during the service. The church porch was also a significant social space, a place where notices were posted, business was sometimes transacted, and people lingered to chat before and after services. It was here, in this semi-sacred, semi-public space, that many betrothals and even marriage ceremonies themselves were conducted, literally at the church door. So, you might find yourself exchanging stilted pleasantries with young John the tanner's son, his face scrubbed unnaturally clean for the occasion, while the priest beams approvingly and half the village pretends not to be listening in. A mainstream historical fact for you. The church porch, or ante-ecclesium, was indeed the location for the exchange of marriage vows in England and parts of Europe for a significant portion of the Middle Ages, with the couple only entering the church for the nuptial mass after they were legally married at the door. It symbolized the marriage as a public, community-sanctioned event before being blessed within the sacred space. For the nobility, tournaments offered another exciting, if highly ritualized, venue for young people to see and be seen. Imagine the color, the pageantry, the thundering hooves and splintering lances. Knights, as we touched upon in our discussion of courtly love, would often dedicate their jousts to a particular lady, wearing her favor a sleeve, a scarf, a glove on their helmet or lance. If you were that lady, you'd be seated in the stands with other noble women, an object of admiration and chivalric devotion. Your betrothed, if he was of a knightly persuasion and not too busy resembling a turnip, might even be one of a Rabelaisian excess of chivalric excess. The interactions here were highly performative, a public display of skill, courage, and idealized romantic allegiance. You might exchange a meaningful glance as he salutes you before a joust, or he might present you with a prize he has won. It's all very grand and theatrical, but again, hardly private. It's like your entire relationship is being live-streamed to an audience of several hundred people in very pointy hats. Within the household itself, opportunities for interaction could arise, especially if, as was common for noble children, you were fostered in another household for education and training, or if you were serving as a lady-in-waiting or a page. This could mean living under the same roof as potential marriage partners. However, even here, supervision was key. Young ladies would be under the watchful eye of the lady of the household, or a designated governess or duenna. Young men would be kept busy with their martial training or other duties, while proximity might allow for more frequent casual encounters passing in a corridor, sharing a meal at the lower tables in the hall. These would still be within the general surveillance of the household. Any attempt at a private tete-a-tete would be quickly noted and likely discouraged, unless it was part of a very deliberate, family-approved matchmaking strategy. The role of the chaperone was therefore absolutely central to medieval courtship, particularly for young women of any social standing. This could be an older female relative, a mother, an aunt, a widowed sister. It could be a trusted older servant, a duenna whose sole purpose was to guard the young lady's virtue and reputation. These chaperones were not just passive observers. They were active guardians, responsible for ensuring that all interactions remained within the bounds of propriety. They would accompany their charge on any outings, be present during any visits from young men, and generally act as a walking, talking embodiment of social decorum. They were the medieval equivalent of a parental lock on your social life, only far more observant and likely to report any infractions directly to headquarters, i.e. your father. You can imagine the sheer frustration of trying to have even a mildly personal conversation with someone when their Aunt Mildred is sitting 3 feet away, knitting furiously and occasionally interjecting with pronouncements on the declining standards of modern youth even in the 14th century. Given these constraints, how did any genuine communication, let alone affection, develop? Well, medieval people were nothing if not resourceful. A whole art of nonverbal communication likely flourished. A lingering glance across a crowded room, a subtle smile, the blush that rose on a maiden's cheek when a certain young man's name was mentioned, these could all speak volumes in a society where words were often restricted. The giving and receiving of those small personal gifts we discussed earlier also became a crucial way of conveying sentiment. A carefully chosen flower, a line of poetry copied onto a scrap of parchment, if both parties were literate, which was by no means a given, especially for women outside the highest nobility or certain urban settings. A shared hymn book in church. These could all be imbued with a significance far beyond their material value. Literacy rates in the medieval period varied enormously by class, gender, and region. While many of a certain class, particularly clergy and some nobility, were literate in Latin tongue, widespread literacy as we know it was centuries away. This meant that for many, love letters were not an option. However, for those who could read and write, a letter could be a precious and potentially risky means of communication. Letters would have to be dictated to scribes if the sender wasn't proficient, and delivered by trusted messengers, all of which added layers of potential exposure. But a successfully exchanged letter, full of carefully crafted sentiments, whether genuine or borrowed from a handy book of model letters, could be a lifeline for a budding romance or a betrothal that felt more like a business transaction. You just have to hope your messenger wasn't a gossip, or that your beloved didn't use your heartfelt prose to light the fire. Intermediaries often played a key role. A trusted servant, a sympathetic relative, even a local priest or friar might act as a go-between, carrying messages, arranging discreet, or at least less overtly public encounters, or sounding out the feelings of one party towards another. This was a delicate business, requiring tact, discretion, and a good understanding of social proprieties. The success of many a medieval match, or even a clandestine flirtation, often rested on the loyalty and skill of these intermediaries. They were the unsung heroes, or perhaps in some cases, a mischievous Cupid of medieval romance, the human equivalent of a secure VPN, trying to create a private channel in a very public world. Despite all the supervision, human nature being what it is, there were undoubtedly attempts at clandestine meetings. The romantic literature of the period is full of tales of lovers meeting secretly in gardens, forests, or abandoned chapels, often with dire consequences if they were discovered. Think of Tristan and Isolde, or Lancelot and Guinevere. While these are idealized and tragic literary examples, they speak to a desire for private connection that surely existed in real life. However, the risks involved in such secret liaisons were enormous. For an unmarried woman, discovery could mean ruin, the loss of her reputation, and the collapse of her marriage prospects. For a man, it could lead to feuds with her family, legal penalties, or even violence. So, while the allure of a stolen moment might be strong, the potential price was terrifyingly high. It makes sneaking out to meet someone your parents disapprove of look like a walk in the park, a park probably owned by your father who has guards posted. Historians still debate how effective all this chaperonage and supervision truly was. Were medieval young people, particularly those in the more restricted upper classes, really as constrained as the prescriptive literature and social norms suggest? Or did they find ingenious ways to circumvent the rules, to steal those private moments, to communicate their feelings despite the ever-watchful eyes. It's likely a mixed picture. Some were undoubtedly more constrained than others. Some were more daring, more rebellious. And the definition of what constituted private was likely very different. A conversation whispered in a crowded hall, a shared glance during a dance, a brief moment alone in a garden while the chaperone was distracted by a particularly interesting squirrel. These might have been treasured as moments of profound intimacy in a world where true privacy was so rare. It's all relative, isn't it? What we might consider a hopelessly public and awkward interaction, they might have seen as a daring and significant step in their relationship. Contrast between the idealized secret meetings of courtly love and the often mundane reality of supervised courtship is stark. The troubadours sang of nights languishing for years, communicating with their beloveds through complex poetic codes and risky clandestine encounters. But for you, Lady Matilda, your courtship of Roger Fitzwalter is more likely to consist of being paraded at a series of family events, making polite conversation about the weather or the quality of the venison, and perhaps, if you're very lucky, discovering that he doesn't actually snore like a rampaging boar. The romance is less in the grand gestures and more in the subtle art of finding some common ground, some small spark of human connection within the very rigid framework laid out for you. You're not looking for fireworks. You're hoping for a distinct lack of open warfare and maybe, just maybe, the possibility of eventually not actively disliking the person you're legally bound to for life. It's a different kind of romantic aspiration, born of necessity and tempered by reality. You've endured the stifling scrutiny of chaperones, haven't you? Practiced the art of the meaningful yet utterly decorous glance across a crowded great hall, and perhaps even deciphered a coded message or two, all in the name of medieval noble courtship. It's a world where privacy is a myth, and every interaction is weighed for its impact on family honor and dynastic ambition. Lady Matilda, you're probably exhausted from the sheer effort of appearing demurely interested in Roger Fitzwalter's riveting discourse on turnip cultivation, all while Aunt Mildred knits a suffocating blanket of propriety around you both. But what if you weren't Lady Matilda? What if, instead of silk kirtles and castle walls, your world was one of rough wool, muddy fields, and the close-knit, often nosy embrace of a village community? The path to partnership for the common folk of the medieval era, the peasants, serfs, artisans, and small traders who made up the vast majority of the population, was a different beast altogether, shaped by different necessities, offering different freedoms, and subject to its own unique set of rules and rituals. Forget for a moment the grand political alliances and the meticulous negotiation of vast landed estates. If you are now Thomas the ploughman or Agnes the spinner, living in a smoky timber-framed cottage with an earthen floor and a chatty collection of livestock, often sharing your living space, or at least very nearby, your concerns about marriage are far more immediate, more intimately tied to the daily struggle for survival. You're not looking for a spouse to bolster your family's claim to a contested duchy. You're looking for a partner who can help you bring in the harvest before the autumn rains rot the grain. Someone whose strong hands can manage a dairy or wield a needle with skill. Someone who can contribute to the relentless, back-breaking labor that defines your existence. Marriage, for the common medieval heart, was first and foremost an economic partnership, a joining of hands not just in symbolic unity, but in the very real toil of wresting a living from the earth or a craft. A mainstream historical fact to set the scene. The manorial system was central to the lives of many peasants in medieval Europe. The manor, controlled by a lord who could be a noble, a bishop, or a monastery, consisted of the lord's demesne, his own land, and lands rented out to peasants, who in return owed him labor services, rents in kind a portion of their crops, for example, or monetary payments. The life of a peasant family revolved around the agricultural calendar, and their ability to work their allotted strips of land, pay their dues, and hopefully have enough left over to feed themselves was paramount. In this context, a spouse was an essential co-worker. A man needed a wife to manage the household, tend the small garden plot, care for poultry and pigs, spin wool or flax for clothing, brew ale, a staple of the medieval diet, often safer than water, bake bread, and of course bear and raise children, who would, from a young age, also contribute to the family's labor pool. A woman needed a husband who could plow the fields, sow and reap the crops, maintain their dwelling, and provide a measure of security. It's all incredibly romantic. We might starve if we don't both pull our weight kind of way. Dowries and dower rights. Dowries and dower rights, those critical components of noble marriage contracts. Agnes the spinner might bring to her marriage a few cherished household goods, a cooking pot, some bedding, perhaps a prized spinning wheel passed down from her mother. She might also bring a small sum of money saved from her own labor, or a piglet, or a couple of chickens. These contributions, however modest, were significant to the establishment of a new peasant household. Similarly, a peasant widow might have rights to a portion of her deceased husband's land or goods for her lifetime, ensuring she wasn't cast out destitute. The sums involved wouldn't trouble the royal exchequer, but they were life and death matters for the individuals concerned. It's like comparing the multi-million-dollar prenups of celebrities to a couple figuring out who gets to keep the good Tupperware if things go south. The scale is different, but the principle of dividing assets is still there. But here's where things get interesting and diverge quite sharply from the experience of your noble counterparts. Commoners often had a greater degree of freedom in choosing their own partners. While parents and the community certainly had a say, and economic viability was always a key consideration, personal attraction and compatibility seemed to have played a more significant role. Young people in a village or a small town would have grown up together, worked alongside each other in the fields or at local markets, and seen each other at church and at village festivities. There was simply more opportunity for natural, unforced interaction, for genuine acquaintance to blossom into affection. You wouldn't need a series of heavily chaperoned, stilted conversations to know if John the Thatcher's son had a kind smile, a strong arm, and a decent reputation for not being a complete wastrel. You'd have seen him in action, observed his character, perhaps even shared a laugh or a flirtatious glance during the May Day celebrations. Village festivals, church ales, parish, fundraising events that often involved much drinking and merriment, market days, and communal work like haymaking or harvesting, were all prime occasions for young people to mingle. Imagine a lively harvest supper in the open air, the day's hard labor done, the ale flowing freely, a fiddler striking up a tune. Young men and women might dance together, a boisterous, energetic affair, full of laughter and flushed cheeks. It's in these moments, away from the constant eye of a duenna or the formal constraints of a castle hall, that preferences could be expressed, understandings reached, and the foundations of a future union laid. There's a raw, earthy vitality to these interactions that stands in stark contrast to the mannered, often stilted encounters of the nobility. Of course, the village elders and the local priest were still keeping a general eye on things. Public drunkenness, brawling, or too overt displays of affection would be frowned upon, but the level of minute-by-minute surveillance was generally less intense. So, if Thomas the ploughman fancies Agnes the spinner, how does he go about it? He doesn't send his father to negotiate with hers over a treaty involving 3 counties and a strategic alliance against a mutual enemy. He might instead try to catch her eye at the village well, offer to help her carry her water buckets, or share a piece of his bread with her during the midday break in the fields. He might give her a small handmade gift, a carved wooden spoon, a bright ribbon bought at a fair, a posy of wildflowers. She in turn might mend his tunic, or save him a particularly good piece of pie at the next village feast. These small gestures, these everyday acts of kindness and burgeoning affection, were the currency of peasant courtship. It was a courtship rooted in shared experience and mutual utility, but not necessarily devoid of genuine feeling. Historians still argue about the relative weight of romantic love versus pragmatic need in peasant marriages. Some scholars suggest that because land and property were less of a factor, personal choice and affection could play a more prominent role. Others argue that economic necessity was so overwhelming that romantic considerations were a luxury few peasants could afford. The reality, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the messy, complicated middle. Once a couple had reached an understanding and their families were generally agreeable, parental consent was still important. And a family might object if they felt the match was unsuitable in terms of reputation, resources, or temperament. The betrothal process was often simpler and more direct than among the nobility. The couple might pledge their troth to each other in front of family members and friends, perhaps with the village priest present to offer a blessing. The exchange of vows, those sponsalia de presenti, I take thee, Agnes, to be my wife, and I take thee, Thomas, to be my husband, still held that crucial marriage-making power in the eyes of the church. Witnesses from the community were vital, as these verbal contracts, often unwritten, needed to be remembered and attested to. Folk customs often played a significant role in these betrothals and weddings. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. In some areas, a tradition known as hand fasting existed, where a couple would join hands, often over a symbolic object, like a stone or through a ring, and declare their intent to marry. This could sometimes be seen as a binding betrothal, or even a form of trial marriage, intended to last for a year and a day, after which the couple could choose to formalize it or go their separate ways, though the church increasingly sought to regulate and absorb such customs into its own official matrimonial framework. The image of two work-roughened hands clasped together, a simple public declaration of intent, is a powerful one, far removed from the elaborate legal documents and dynastic negotiations of the elite. The period between betrothal and the formal church wedding among commoners might also see a greater degree of accepted intimacy, or at least opportunity for it, than among the more stringently supervised nobility. While premarital sex was officially condemned by the church, and illegitimacy carried a significant social stigma, the reality in many rural communities was somewhat more flexible, particularly if a couple was formally betrothed and a marriage was clearly intended. Sometimes, a pregnancy might even precipitate the formal wedding ceremony. Manorial court records occasionally show fines being levied for fornication, but often these were relatively small, and if the couple subsequently married, the transgression was largely forgiven by the community, if not entirely by the sterner elements of the clergy. It was a pragmatic world, and a child on the way was, after all, a future laborer. The wedding itself for a peasant couple would be a joyous, if simple, community affair. There would be a service at the church door, followed by the nuptial mass inside, then a feast, not in a grand castle hall with silver platters and troops of minstrels, but perhaps in the bride's family cottage or in a common village space, with trestle tables laden with homely fare bread, cheese, stew, home-brewed ale. The whole village might contribute food and drink, and there would be music, dancing, and much ribaldry. The community celebrated not just the union of two individuals, but the strengthening of its own fabric, the promise of future generations. It was a far cry from the stately, politically charged weddings of the nobility, but perhaps no less meaningful, and arguably a good deal more fun. You probably wouldn't get a gift of 3 prize-winning oxen, but you might get a very useful new milking pail and a lot of well-intentioned, slightly tipsy advice on how to ensure a good harvest of both crops and children. However, it's important not to romanticize peasant life too much. While they may have had more freedom in choosing their partners based on affection, their lives were incredibly hard, subject to the whims of weather, disease, famine, and the demands of their lords. The choice of a spouse was still heavily constrained by economic necessity. Marrying someone who was lazy, sickly, or from a desperately poor family could be a recipe for disaster. The community, while supportive, was also a powerful force for conformity. A couple who flouted social norms too egregiously, or a marriage that was seen as deeply unsuitable, could face ostracism or ridicule. The Charivari, a noisy, mocking ritual where villagers would bang pots and pans outside the house of a couple whose union was deemed inappropriate, perhaps a widower marrying a much younger woman, or a marriage notorious for adultery or domestic abuse, was a potent form of community disapproval. It's like a medieval public shaming on social media, only with more clanging and less sophisticated grammar. So, for you, Thomas the Ploughman, your path to marriage is less about poring over deeds and more about assessing Agnes's skill at the butter churn. For you, Agnes the Spinner, it's less about your future husband's coat of arms and more about the strength of his back and the kindness in his eyes. The stakes are just as high: survival, companionship, the future of your family, but the game is played on a different field, with slightly different rules, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little more room for the common heart to have its say. The pressures are different. The freedoms are different. But the fundamental human desire for partnership, for a shared life, for someone to face the harsh realities of the medieval world with, remains a constant, whether you're in a drafty castle or in a smoky cottage. You've wandered through the pragmatic world of peasant matchmaking, haven't you? Imagined yourself as Thomas the Ploughman or Agnes the Spinner, where a strong back or nimble fingers might be as attractive as a comely face, and the village festival offers a chance for a somewhat freer, if still community-scrutinized, courtship. It's a far cry from the gilded cage of noble alliances, with its chaperones and dynastic pressures that we explored earlier. But whether you were a lowly serf tethered to the land, or a mighty baron with a drafty castle to your name, there was one overarching institution whose influence on matters of love, partnership, and procreation was inescapable, whose rules and inescapable pronouncements shaped the very fabric of medieval society: the Church. In Western Europe, this meant the Roman Catholic Church, a spiritual monolith whose authority extended into the most intimate corners of human existence, including, most definitely, who you could marry, why you could marry, and what you were, weren't supposed to do once you were married. Forget for a moment the worldly calculations of dowries and dower rights, or the ethereal flights of courtly fancy. The Church approached marriage with its own profound and divinely ordained agenda. Marriage, it taught, was not merely a social contract or an economic partnership. It was a sacrament, one of the 7 sacred rites through which God's grace was channeled to humanity. This elevated matrimony to a spiritual plane, imbuing it with a sanctity and a seriousness that transcended purely secular concerns. When you, as a medieval Christian, stood before the church door to exchange your vows, you weren't just making a promise to another person or another family. You were entering into a holy covenant, witnessed by God and his earthly representatives. This made the whole business feel rather more significant than just agreeing to share a turnip patch or a title. This sacramental view of marriage had profound implications. One of the most significant was the principle of indissolubility. Once a valid marriage, properly consented to and consummated, was established, it was considered binding until death. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Divorce, in the modern sense of a legal dissolution of a valid marriage allowing for remarriage, simply didn't exist. What did exist? though it was often a complex, costly, and politically charged process usually accessible only to the wealthy and powerful, was annulment. An annulment was a declaration by an ecclesiastical court that no valid marriage had ever existed in the first place. Due to some pre-existing impediment, perhaps the couple was too closely related consanguinity. One party had a prior binding marriage or betrothal. There was a lack of true consent, e.g., coercion, or one of the parties was impotent and the marriage unconsummated. Finding such an impediment, especially for a king desperate for a male heir from a new wife, could involve some rather creative legal arguments and a great deal of ecclesiastical wrangling. For your average peasant couple, however, once you were hitched, you were generally hitched for life, for better or for worse, or for until the plague do us part, which sadly was often a more realistic timeline. The Church, as we touched upon when discussing betrothals, placed great emphasis on the free consent of both parties for a marriage to be valid. Consensus facit nuptias, consent makes the marriage, was a key legal principle. This was a rather progressive idea in some ways, especially for women, as it theoretically gave them the right to refuse a forced marriage. However, as we've also noted, the gap between theological ideal and social reality could be vast. The pressure from families to consent to an arranged match, particularly for a young woman whose future security and her family's strategic interests were at stake, could be immense. Outright defiance was rare, and often met with severe disapproval or even punishment. So, while you might have to say, "I do" of your own volition, that volition was often heavily guided, shall we say, by a chorus of very persuasive and sometimes rather intimidating parental and societal voices. It's like being told you have free choice, but all the options on the menu are variations of boiled cabbage, and your father is standing over you with a very large spoon. One of the Church's most intricate, and to modern eyes, baffling areas of marital regulation concerned the prohibited degrees of kinship. To prevent incest and promote social harmony by forcing families to marry outside their immediate circle, the Church forbade marriage between relatives up to a certain degree of relatedness, both by blood consanguinity and by marriage affinity. Relationships created through marriage, like a brother-in-law. A mainstream historical fact for you. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a hugely influential church council convened by Pope Innocent III, reformed and somewhat simplified these rules, reducing the prohibited degrees of consanguinity from 7 to 4. Calculating these degrees could be a genealogist's nightmare. It meant counting back to a common ancestor. If you shared a common great-great-grandparent, for example, you were within the fourth degree and couldn't marry without a special dispensation from the Church. These dispensations were, of course, often easier to obtain if you were wealthy and influential. For ordinary folk, discovering you were accidentally related to your beloved within the forbidden degrees after you'd already exchanged vows could throw your entire marriage and the legitimacy of your children into question. It added a whole new layer of anxiety to finding the one. Not just is he nice, but also is he my mother's cousin's nephew's son? And if so, do we need to send a petition to the bishop? So why did the Church believe people should get married, apart from it being a sacrament? Several key purposes were emphasized. Firstly, and most importantly in many theological discussions, was procreation. To be fruitful and multiply. Children were seen as a blessing from God, and the primary legitimate purpose of sexual union within marriage was to produce offspring who would be raised in the Christian faith. Secondly, marriage was seen as a remedy for concupiscence, a rather unflattering term for sexual desire. Recognizing that human beings were, well, human and prone to lustful thoughts and actions, the Church taught that marriage provided a legitimate outlet for sexual urges, channeling them towards procreation and away from sin. Thirdly, marriage was for mutual help and companionship. a partnership where husband and wife supported each other through the trials of life. While this sounds rather more romantic, it was often listed after procreation and the remedy for sin in terms of theological importance. The idea that you married primarily for love and personal fulfillment, as we often think of it today, was not high on the church's official list of reasons. This brings us to the church's views on sexuality itself, a topic it had a great deal to say about. Within marriage, sexual activity was permissible, ideally for the purpose of procreation. However, even marital sex could be subject to restrictions. Intercourse was often forbidden on certain holy days, during Lent, on Sundays, during menstruation, or while a woman was pregnant or nursing. The marital debt, the idea that spouses owed each other sexual access, was recognized, but it was still framed within the context of avoiding sin and fulfilling the procreative purpose. Any sexual act that was deemed unnatural or non-procreative, even between husband and wife, was condemned. Pleasure, for its own sake, was viewed with suspicion, a potential pathway to lust and damnation. It's a rather austere view of intimacy, a far cry from the sensual abandon sometimes hinted at in more secular literature or folk traditions. You get the feeling that if medieval theologians design a dating app, the primary compatibility question would be, are you both aiming for optimally timed, spiritually sanctioned procreation with minimal enjoyment? Outside of marriage, the church's condemnation of sexual activity was absolute. Premarital sex, fornication, extramarital affairs, adultery, and any homosexual acts were all considered serious sins, offensive to God and detrimental to the social and moral order. The concept of sin and the need for repentance and penance was deeply ingrained in the medieval psyche. Confession to a priest was a regular requirement, and individuals would be expected to confess their sexual transgressions, which could range from lustful thoughts to actual deeds. The priest would then assign a penance, perhaps fasting, prayers, almsgiving, or even a pilgrimage to atone for the sin. This system of confession and penance was a powerful tool for social control, shaping individual conscience and reinforcing the church's moral teachings. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some surviving medieval penitentials' manuals for confessors list remarkably specific penances for a vast array of sexual sins, sometimes varying the severity based on the perceived unnaturalnesses of the act or the marital status of the individual involved. It's like a very detailed and rather depressing sin-by-sin price list for your soul. The enforcement of these moral and marital regulations was managed through various channels. Ecclesiastical courts run by the church had jurisdiction over matters relating to marriage, including disputes over betrothals, annulment cases, and issues of legitimacy. These courts could summon individuals, hear testimony, and impose penalties, which might range from public penance to fines, or, in extreme cases, excommunication, a terrifying prospect in an age where being cut off from the church meant being cut off from the church meant being cut off from God's grace and often from the community itself. Preaching from the pulpit was another powerful tool. Sermons would regularly remind the congregation of their duties as husbands and wives, the sanctity of marriage, the evils of lust, and the importance of raising their children in the fear of God. The visual imagery in churches, stained glass windows, sculptures, wall paintings depicting scenes from the Bible, the lives of saints, and sometimes graphic representations of the Last Judgment with sinners being cast into hellfire also served as constant, vivid reminders of the church's teachings and the consequences of transgression. But how effective was all this control? Did medieval people, in the privacy of their own lives, however limited that privacy might be, actually adhere strictly to these often demanding rules? This is a subject of ongoing debate among historians. Some argued that the church's influence was pervasive and deeply internalized, shaping the very way people thought about themselves, their bodies, and their relationships. Others suggest that while people might have outwardly conformed, particularly in public, there was often a significant gap between the official doctrines of the church and the actual practices of everyday life. Folk traditions, local customs, and basic human desires didn't just disappear in the face of theological pronouncements. We've already seen how peasant communities might have a somewhat more pragmatic approach to premarital pregnancy if marriage was intended. And the popularity of courtly love literature, with its often adulterous themes, suggests that ideals of romantic passion, even if forbidden, held a powerful allure, at least for some. The church itself was not a monolithic entity, and the enforcement of its rules could vary by region, by the zeal of the local bishop or priest. And over the long span of the Middle Ages, there were periods of reform and crackdown, and periods of greater laxity. And of course, human beings are adept at finding ways to negotiate, rationalize, or selectively ignore rules that conflict with their desires or perceived needs. So while the official doctrine might be clear, the lived experience of love, sex, and marriage in the medieval period was likely a complex tapestry woven from threads of piety, passion, pragmatism, and transgression. For you, our medieval individual, the church teachings on marriage and morality would be an undeniable part of your mental landscape. From your earliest childhood, you would have absorbed its lessons through sermons, stories, images, and the expectations of your community. Whether you embraced these teachings with fervent belief, chafed under their restrictions, or found a way to privately navigate a path between doctrine and desire, you could not ignore them. They shaped your understanding of what it meant to be a good Christian, a good spouse, a good parent. They defined the boundaries of acceptable behavior and the terrifying consequences of straying beyond them. As you approached marriage, the priest's blessing, the church ceremony, the public affirmation of your vows within the sacred context of the church, all these would be profoundly important, not just for social legitimacy, but for your own spiritually peace of mind. The sacred vows you took were not just to your partner, but to God, and that, in the medieval world, was the most binding contract of all. It makes modern prenups look like a friendly agreement scribbled on a napkin. You've dutifully absorbed the church's stance on matrimony, haven't you? Understood that those sacred vows, ideally taken with free consent, and for the primary purpose of procreation with a side order of companionship and remedying concupiscence, of course, were meant to be unbreakable, divinely sanctioned, and the bedrock of a good Christian life. The rules were clear, the sermons were stern, and the thought of hellfire was, for many, a pretty effective deterrent against straying too far from the righteous path. But here's the thing about human beings, medieval or modern. Our hearts and other assorted anatomical regions have a notorious habit of not always consulting the rulebook. Despite the best efforts of popes, priests, parents, and primogeniture, love, lust, and sheer stubbornness sometimes led medieval folk down paths that were decidedly off-piste into the thrilling and often perilous territory of illicit vows, forbidden love, and the kind of feuds that could make your average family holiday squabble look like a vicar's tea party. So what happened when someone decided to ignore their carefully arranged, dynastically advantageous betrothal to, say, the eminently suitable but soul-crushingly dull Roger Fitzwalter, and instead found their heart inexplicably drawn to perhaps a landless younger son with a charming smile and a worrying penchant for composing poetry? Or what if a marriage, entered into with all due solemnity, turned out to be a cold and barren prison, and a wandering eye alighted upon a more congenial and equally married soul at the next ducal banquet? The medieval world, for all its rigidity, was not immune to the disruptive power of human passion. It just had a rather more dramatic, and often more dangerous, way of dealing with the fallout. Let's first consider clandestine marriages, or elopements. Remember how we discussed that the Church, in its wisdom, decreed that the free consent of the two individuals, sponsalia de presenti, was the absolute cornerstone of a valid marriage. even if no priest or witnesses were present. Well, this doctrine, while intended to uphold individual will against familial coercion, also inadvertently opened a rather tempting loophole for couples whose union was opposed by their families. If you and your beloved, say Thomas the charming but penniless minstrel, knew your respective fathers would sooner see you both join a silent monastic order than marry each other, you might be tempted to find a quiet moment, perhaps under the concealing branches of an ancient oak or in a secluded corner of a forgotten chapel, and exchange those potent, present tense vows. I, Eleanor, take thee, Thomas, to my husband, and I, Thomas, take thee, Eleanor, to my wife. Boom. In the eyes of God and the church, you were technically married. Simple, right? Well, not quite. While the church might, after much investigation, and perhaps some hefty fees for an ecclesiastical court hearing, eventually uphold the validity of your secret marriage, if both of you stuck to your story, and there were no prior binding contracts or impediments like being too closely related, which you'd hopefully have checked before your clandestine canoodling. Your families would likely be incandescent with rage. You've just torpedoed their carefully laid plans, insulted their authority, and potentially jeopardized alliances and inheritances. The social consequences could be severe. Disinheritance, ostracism, even violence if honor was deemed to have been sufficiently impugned. Your romantic elopement might result in you being very much in love, very much married, and very, very poor and unwelcome pretty much everywhere. It's the medieval equivalent of getting married in Vegas by an Elvis impersonator against your parents' wishes, only instead of them just cutting off your allowance, they might actually try to have your marriage annulled on a technicality, or, in extreme cases, lock you in a tower. Less viva Las Vegas, more vita misera. Famous historical cases, like the tragic story of Heloise and Abelard in 12th century Paris, illustrate the perilous nature of such unsanctioned unions. Though theirs involved a renowned scholar and his brilliant student, a secret marriage after a pregnancy, and ultimately brutal retaliation from Heloise's enraged uncle. While their situation was unique in its intellectual context, the underlying themes of forbidden love, secret vows, and devastating consequences resonated through medieval society, a mainstream historical fact. The Council of Trent in the 16th century, much later than our main medieval focus, but building on centuries of attempts to control marriage, would eventually decree that, for a marriage to be valid, it must be before a priest and two witnesses, precisely to curb such clandestine unions and the endless legal disputes they caused. But for much of the medieval period, that loophole of consent, however fraught with peril, remained. Then there was the ever-present issue of adultery, the breaking of those sacred marital vows after the fact. In a world of arranged marriages, where love was often an afterthought or entirely absent, and where courtly love sometimes dangled the tantalizing ideal of passionate, extramarital devotion, at least in literature, it's hardly surprising that some individuals sought emotional or physical solace outside their legitimate unions. The consequences, however, could be dire, and, as was so often the case, they differed significantly for men and women. A husband's dalliances, while officially condemned by the church as sinful, were often viewed with a degree of societal tolerance, especially if he was discreet and continued to fulfill his marital duties of providing for his wife and legitimate children. His infidelity might be a source of private sorrow or public gossip, but it rarely threatened his legal or social standing in the same way it did a woman's. For a wife, however, adultery was a far more serious offense. It threatened the legitimacy of her husband's heirs, the very foundation of patrilineal inheritance and family honor. If discovered, an adulterous wife could face severe punishment. Public shaming, being paraded through the streets, perhaps forced to wear a distinguishing garment, confinement in a convent, repudiation by her husband, though full divorce, allowing his remarriage was still off the table, and the loss of her dower rights. Her lover, too, could face harsh penalties, including fines, imprisonment, castration, or even death, depending on the laws of the region and the status of the cuckolded husband. The epic romances of Lancelot and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde, might paint adultery in tragic, heroic hues, but the real-life consequences for less legendary lovers were usually grim and decidedly unromantic. It was less star-crossed lovers and more slightly crossed the line and now facing an ecclesiastical court, and possibly an angry husband with a very large sword. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. Various folk methods and superstitions existed for supposedly detecting an unfaithful spouse. These might involve observing their behavior, interpreting dreams, or even using magical charms or rituals, none of which, is safe to say, would hold up in a modern court of law, and probably didn't do much for marital trust in the medieval period either. Imagine accusing your spouse based on the way a certain toad croaked outside your window. Awkward. Public shaming rituals for adulterers could also be quite elaborate and humiliating. In some places, a woman found guilty might be forced to ride backwards on a donkey, holding its tail, while the community jeered. It was a potent form of social control, designed to deter others and reinforce the sanctity of the marital bond through brutal humiliation. What about broken betrothals? We've established that these were serious contracts, not to be entered into lightly. But what if, after the vows were exchanged and the gifts given, one party had second thoughts? Or what if a more advantageous match suddenly presented itself? Or perhaps one of those pesky impediments, like undisclosed prior vow, or a closer than realized blood relationship, came to light. Breaking a betrothal, especially one made presentee, was akin to seeking an annulment and required navigating the complexities of canon law. For sponsoria de futuro, a promise to marry in the future, there was slightly more wiggle room, but just cause was still generally required. Simply deciding you didn't like the way Roger Fitzwalter chewed his food, or that his conversation about turnips was, in fact, terminally dull, wasn't usually considered sufficient grounds to break a formal pact that might have involved significant financial and political commitments between two powerful families. The consequences of a broken betrothal could be severe. Legally, the jilted party or their family could sue for breach of promise in an ecclesiastical court, demanding specific performance, i.e., that the marriage go ahead, or financial compensation for damages, including the return of dowry or gifts. Socially, a broken betrothal could lead to a loss of reputation for all involved. The party deemed at fault could be seen as untrustworthy, dishonorable. Feuds between families, already a common feature of the medieval landscape, could be ignited or exacerbated by such a public breach of faith. Imagine the simmering resentment, the muttered threats, the potential for armed conflict between retainers, all because young Lord Percy decided he rather fancied Lady Isabel from the next county more than his duly betrothed Lady Agnes, whose father happened to be Lord Percy's father's most bitter rival. It's like a medieval soap opera with more chainmail and a higher body count. Historians still argue about the actual frequency and success rate of attempts to break betrothals, particularly when initiated by the individuals themselves rather than their families. While the system was heavily weighted in favor of upholding these contracts, there are recorded instances of individuals, even women, successfully resisting unwanted matches or extricating themselves from undesirable betrothals, often by appealing to the church on grounds of coercion or a pre-existing impediment. It required courage, determination, and often influential allies or a very good canon lawyer. It wasn't easy, but the possibility, however slim, existed. Beyond these more conventional forms of illicit love and broken vows, there were other relationships that defied medieval norms. Love across significant social divides, a noble lady falling for a common soldier, or a wealthy merchant's son for a serving wench, was generally frowned upon, and rarely led to legitimate marriage. though it certainly fueled many a romantic ballad and cautionary tale. Such unions, if they occurred at all, would likely be clandestine and highly precarious, lacking the social and legal protections of a recognized marriage. Similarly, relationships involving members of the clergy, who were supposed to be celibate though clerical concubinage was a persistent issue the church struggled to control, or relationships deemed unnatural by the church, such as homosexual unions, were subject to severe condemnation and punishment, both ecclesiastical and secular. To love outside the prescribed lines was to risk not just social censure, but often your liberty, your property, and even your life. The medieval world then, for all its apparent order and hierarchy, was still a place of human passion, folly, and defiance. The rules were strict, the consequences of breaking them often brutal. But the desire for love, for connection, for autonomy, sometimes proved too strong to be entirely suppressed. The illicit vows whispered in secret, the forbidden glances exchanged across a crowded room, the desperate attempts to escape an unwanted marriage, these are the stories that often don't make it into the grand chronicles of kings and battles, but they speak to the enduring complexities of the human heart. Even in an age that tried so hard to keep it firmly under lock and key. For you, a medieval time traveler, it's a sobering reminder that even when society dictates every step of the dance, some people will always try to invent their own, however dangerous the rhythm. It makes you appreciate that slightly awkward but ultimately harmless first date over lukewarm coffee, doesn't it? At least no one's likely to start a blood feud if you decide not to call them back. You've navigated the treacherous waters of forbidden love in a time when social dictate and ecclesiastical law held immense sway, haven't you? Imagined the desperate whispers of clandestine lovers, the fury of families scorned by broken betrothals, the sheer audacity of those who dared to love outside the heavily policed lines of medieval propriety. It's a world of high drama, where a misplaced affection could lead to feuds, disinheritance, or worse. But as the torchlight fades on these tales of illicit vows and defiant hearts, as the echoes of medieval scandal recede into the mists of history, you, our dear listener, find yourself gently returning to your own time, your own bed. And yet the journey isn't quite over. For the long, complex, and often bewildering history of how humans have sought partnership, how they've defined love, and how they've navigated the path to marriage, leaves indelible traces. The medieval period, with its pragmatic alliances, its soaring ideals of courtly romance, and its deeply ingrained social codes, has cast long shadows, and faint, surprising echoes of yesterday's romance still whisper in the background of our moderns. Relationships. It might seem like a ludicrous stretch to compare your 21st century quest for love, perhaps involving dating apps that offer a seemingly endless catalog of potential partners, or the anxieties of crafting the perfect text message, with the highly structured, family-driven matchmaking of medieval Europe. After all, you're not likely to have your marriage arranged to settle a dispute over grazing rights or to consolidate two rival software companies, though. Come to think of it, some modern power couple mergers do have a certain dynastic ring to them, don't they? You have freedom of choice, a degree of autonomy in your romantic life that would have been utterly alien, almost fantastical, to Lady Matilda contemplating her turnip-loving Roger, or to Thomas the ploughman hoping Agnes the spinner might share her midday bread with him. And yet are we so very different? Consider the ideals of romantic love that still permeate our culture, that breathless, heart-pounding, all-consuming passion, the idea of a soulmate, the notion that love can ennoble us and inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. Where do these potent ideas come from? While human beings have undoubtedly experienced passionate love throughout history, the specific flavor of Western Romanticism owes a considerable debt to those medieval troubadours and their songs of fin amour. Remember the chivalrous knight dedicating his every deed to his idealized often unattainable, lady, the exquisite suffering of longing, the grand romantic gestures, the belief that true love is a transcendent, almost spiritual force. These are the very tropes that fill our movies, our novels, our popular song. The knight in shining armor may have been replaced by a pop star with a sensitive soul, or a billionaire with a private jet and a hidden vulnerability, but the underlying fantasy of a love that elevates, that completes, that gives life meaning. That's a powerful medieval echo. We still crave the grand gesture, the declaration of undying devotion, the feeling of being utterly adored, even if we're also supposed to be cynical, independent 21st century individuals. A mainstream historical fact for you. While the concept of courtly love was largely an aristocratic literary phenomenon of the High Middle Ages, its themes and sensibilities gradually filtered down and transformed, influencing broader European ideas about love and courtship over subsequent centuries, eventually contributing to the development of modern romantic ideals. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't a direct, uncomplicated line. But the DNA of those chivalric romances is still present in our romantic expectations. We might not expect our beloved to slay a literal dragon for us, but we do often hope they'll slay the metaphorical dragons of our insecurities or our bad days at work. It's just a slightly less messy and generally less fatal form of chivalric service. And what about the rituals of modern dating and marriage? Think about the giving of rings. We saw how betrothal rings were exchanged in the medieval period, symbolizing an eternal bond, while the diamond engagement ring as a ubiquitous symbol is a much later invention, largely thanks to a very successful 20th century marketing campaign by De Beers. Sorry to burst that ancient tradition bubble. The act of giving a ring to signify commitment has deep historical roots. The vows we exchange at modern weddings, with their promises of love, honor, and fidelity, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, echo the solemn, binding words of those medieval sponsalia de presenti. Even the idea of a bride wearing white, though it became widely popularized by Queen Victoria in the 19th century, has earlier associations with purity and maidenhood that the medieval church would certainly have approved of, even if medieval brides themselves often wore their best dress, regardless of color. These are threads of continuity, rituals that connect our most modern celebrations of love back to ancient traditions. Of course, the most profound difference lies in the basis of marriage. For much of the medieval period, as we've explored in excruciating, sleepy detail, marriage was primarily a pragmatic alliance, especially for the property-owning classes. Love, if it existed, was a happy accident, not a prerequisite. Today, in most Western cultures at least, the overwhelming expectation is that you marry for love. Romantic love is seen as the essential foundation for a lifelong partnership. This shift from marriage as a socio-economic contract to marriage as a union based on personal affection and individual choice is one of the most significant transformations in the history of Western relationships. It's a revolution that took centuries, fueled by changing economic structures, evolving philosophical ideas about individualism, and the gradual romanticizing of marriage itself. You no longer have to marry Roger Fitzwalter just because his turnip fields are conveniently adjacent to your father's. You can hold out for someone who at least knows what a conversation is. Progress. And yet, do pragmatic considerations truly play no role in our modern choices? When people consider a long-term partner, do they not, at some level, think about financial stability, shared values regarding work and family, or whether their prospective mate seems like a reliable and supportive co-parent? Perhaps these considerations are less explicit, less openly negotiated than in medieval times, but they often lurk beneath the surface of romantic attraction. The language has changed. We talk about compatibility, and shared life goals rather than consolidation of estates and production of male heirs, but the underlying desire for a partner who can contribute to a stable and prosperous life together hasn't entirely vanished. Historians still argue whether the modern emphasis on romantic love as the sole basis for marriage places an unsustainable burden on relationships, potentially leading to disappointment when the initial fires of passion inevitably cool, or whether it genuinely leads to more fulfilling and emotionally satisfying partnerships than the arranged marriages of the past. It's a complex question with no easy answer. We also cherish our freedom of choice in a way that would have been unimaginable to most medieval people. The idea of parents or families dictating who we should marry seems archaic, even oppressive, to many of us. We swipe, we mingle, we date, we cohabit, all in the pursuit of finding that perfect or perfect enough partner through our own efforts and based on our own feelings. And yet, are we entirely free from external pressures? Think of the influence of social media, the carefully curated images of romantic bliss that can make our own messier realities feel inadequate. Think of the pressure from friends, from family, even if they're not outright arranging your marriage. They might still have opinions from societal narratives about when and whom we should settle down with. The medieval maiden faced the scrutiny of her village or court. We face the scrutiny of our Instagram followers and our anxiously awaiting relatives at holiday gatherings. The methods of surveillance have changed, but the human desire for social approval and the fear of making the wrong choice in a partner remain potent forces. The very act of dating itself, while so different in its modern form, still carries echoes of older courtship rituals. The initial awkwardness, the attempts to impress, the careful presentation of self, the exchange of small tokens, even if it's just paying for coffee or sending a funny meme, the gradual progression towards greater intimacy. These are all part of a dance that humans have been performing in various forms for centuries. The medieval suitor might offer a song or a poem. The modern suitor might craft the perfect playlist or a witty Tinder bio. The tools are different, but the underlying aim to attract, to connect, to assess compatibility shares a common thread. A quirky tidbit for you. Some modern online dating profiles, with their meticulously listed attributes, desired qualities in a partner, and declarations of intent, almost read like a 21st century version of a medieval marriage contract. Negotiation, albeit one conducted by the individuals themselves. Geo likes long walks and slaying metaphorical dragons, seeks solvent partner for potential LTR and procreation of 2.5 children. Must have own horse or reliable hatchback. The anxieties surrounding relationships also have a timeless quality. The medieval individual feared being trapped in a loveless or abusive marriage, or failing to secure a match that would ensure their economic survival. We fear loneliness, repeated romantic failure, the pain of heartbreak, or choosing a partner who turns out to be, well, less than advertised. The fear of a bad match is perennial. In medieval times, a bad match could mean a lifetime of misery with no socially acceptable exit strategy. Today, while we have more freedom to leave unhappy relationships, the emotional toll of a failed partnership can still be immense. The quest for a secure and fulfilling connection is a fundamental human endeavor, and it's rarely without its share of anxiety, regardless of the century. Perhaps one of the most valuable lessons we can glean from looking back at medieval dating is a greater appreciation for the freedoms we now possess, but also a recognition that love and relationships have always been complex, shaped by a multitude of factors beyond just individual emotion. The medieval world reminds us that marriage has, for much of history, been deeply intertwined with economics, politics, and social structure. It reminds us that ideals of love are often culturally constructed and can change dramatically over time. And it reminds us that even within the most rigid of systems, human beings have always found ways to seek connection, to express affection, and to navigate the often turbulent waters of the heart. The story of medieval courtship, with its pragmatic alliances, its soaring courtly ideals, its supervised encounters, and its occasional daring defiances, is not just a collection of quaint historical detail. It's a testament to the enduring human drive to form bonds, to create families, to find companionship, and, if lucky, love, in whatever form their society allows or idealizes. As you, dear listener, prepare to drift off to sleep, perhaps you can reflect on your own journey through the world of relationships, with all its modern complexities and freedoms. The path may be different, the rules may have changed, but the fundamental yearning for connection, for a hand to hold in the metaphorical darkness, is a melody that has played through the human heart for centuries. A faint but persistent echo of a yesterday's romance in today's restless world. Word count 5058. And now, as our long journey through the dimly lit halls of history, exploring first the restless nights of Victorian insomniacs and their quest for sleep in a bowl of lettuce soup, and then delving even deeper into the past, to the torchlit late world of medieval courtship, with its strategic alliances and chaperoned glances, begins to draw to its close for tonight. Let the pace of our thoughts soften. Let the edges of these images blur just a little. You've walked through gaslit Victorian bedrooms, heavy with the scent of coal smoke and anxiety, feeling the oppressive weight of sleeplessness, the desperate hope invested in each potential remedy, from laudanum's dangerous allure to the simple, green promise of a humble vegetable. You've stood in imaginary Victorian kitchens, haven't you? Watching that domestic alchemy, the transformation of lettuce into a soothing, hopeful broth, a quiet act of self-care in a world thrumming with the anxieties of a new industrial age. You've heard the whispers of ancient lore, tracing lettuce's sleepy reputation back through Roman banquets and Egyptian temple gardens, a slender green thread of folk wisdom winding through millennia. You've listened to the earnest, if sometimes bewildering, theories of Victorian physicians attempting to explain the mystery of sleep, and you've sifted through the anecdotal evidence, the chorus of voices swearing by or swearing at the efficacy of that verdant soup. You've seen how it faced formidable competition from more potent, perilous comforts, and how, like a gentle fad, its quiet glow eventually began to fade as new scientific certainties and societal habits took hold, leaving behind only the faintest, most nostalgic of echoes. And then, as if drifting through a dream, you found yourself even further back in time, treading the unpaved paths of the medieval world. You've seen how the very notion of dating, as we understand it, would have been an alien concept, replaced by the far more serious and strategic business of marriage. You've peered into the negotiations of noble families, where alliances were forged and assets, including you perhaps, were carefully weighed, where love was a fortunate accident rather than a foundational requirement. You've glimpsed the glittering, ethereal ideals of courtly love, with its chivalrous knights and unattainable ladies, a romantic counterpoint to the often unromantic realities of arranged unions, a code of exquisite suffering and ennobling devotion that still, surprisingly, colors our modern romantic fantasies. You've witnessed the solemnity of betrothal, those binding promises made before family and church, sealed not just with words, but with treasured gifts that spoke a language of their own rings and ribbons, symbols of faith and future intertwine. You felt the constraints of supervised courtship, the guarded glances and whispered conversations under the ever-watchful eyes of chaperones, and a close-knit, often judgmental community, a far cry from the privacy we so often take for granted. You've contrasted this with the somewhat freer, more earthy paths to partnership trodden by the common folk, where shared labor and mutual utility might more readily blend with personal affection, even if life itself was a harsh and constant struggle. You felt the immense overarching authority of the medieval church, defining marriage as a sacrament, dictating its rules, shaping sexual morality, and holding sway over the most intimate aspects of life, from the cradle to the grave. And you've explored the perilous territory of forbidden love, the illicit vows and secret affairs, the broken betrothals and family feuds that erupted when human passion dared to defy the rigid structures of the age. Through all these centuries, through all these changing customs and beliefs, one constant remains: the human heart, with its capacity for longing, for hope, for connection, for love in its myriad forms. Whether in a Victorian four-poster bed fretting over sleeplessness, or in a medieval castle contemplating a dynastic marriage, or in your very own bed, right here, right now, that quiet yearning for peace, for comfort, for understanding is a universal thread. The anxieties may change their shape, the remedies their formulation, the courtship rituals their form, but the underlying needs persist. And as these thoughts begin to soften and merge, like watercolors in a gentle rain, allow your own mind to grow quiet. Let the weight of history, with all its fascinating details and curious customs, settle gently around you, not as a burden, but as a deep, soft cushion. You've journeyed far tonight. You've learned, you've imagined, you've perhaps even chuckled softly at the follies and fancies of those who came before us. And now there is nothing more to learn, nothing more to explore for this night. The story is told. The players have taken their bows. The lamps, both gas and torch, have been extinguished. Feel the gentle support of your own bed beneath you, the comfort of your pillows, the soft weight of your blankets. Notice the quiet rhythm of your own breathing, that steady, unconscious tide, in and out, a natural lullaby that has soothed countless souls through countless nights. If any lingering thoughts from our journey, or from your own day, still flicker at the edges of your awareness, just acknowledge them gently, like distant stars in a vast, dark sky, and let them be. They don't need your attention now. Your only task, your only gentle invitation, is to allow yourself to drift, to release, to let go. Imagine the quietest, most peaceful medieval monastery garden, late at night, under a canopy of innumerable stars. The air is cool and still, carrying only the faintest scent of herbs and damp earth. The only sound is the soft hoot of a distant owl, a sound that speaks not of alarm, but of the deep, natural peace of the sleeping world. There are no demands here, no anxieties, no pressing concerns, just the profound, ancient stillness of the night. A stillness that has existed long before castles were built or remedies were brewed. A stillness that will endure long after all our modern... A stillness that will endure long after all our modern... Allow yourself to sink deeper into that feeling of quietude, that sense of release. Let your muscles soften, from the tiny muscles around your eyes to your jaw, your shoulders, your arms, your legs. Let go of any tension you might be holding. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, except right here, resting peacefully. The stories of the past are now just gentle echoes, fading into a comfortable silence. The concerns of tomorrow are for another time, a time that is not now. Now is for rest. Now is for peace. Now is for the quiet, healing embrace of sleep. Let the darkness be a soft velvet cloak, enfolding you in its comforting embrace. Let the silence be a soothing balm. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are ready now to drift into a deep and profoundly restful sleep.